The train doors opened, and Clara's carefully planned future shattered in an instant. The man stepping onto the platform wasn't just a stranger, he was silent. Not shy, not reserved, unable to speak. Her mail-order husband had come with a secret that would either destroy them both or teach her what love truly meant. But before you discover how their story unfolds, I need you to do something. Watch this until the very end, and comment below with your city name so I can see how far this story travels across the world. The Dakota Territory had a way of stripping people down to their bare essentials. In the spring of 1886, it didn't care about your dreams or your desperation. It only cared whether you could survive. Clara Whitmore understood this better than most. At 26, she'd already buried a father, lost the family store to debt, and watched her younger sister marry off to a merchant in Philadelphia who made it clear there was no room for extra mouths to feed. Standing on the weather-beaten platform of Redemption Station, Clara clutched a worn leather satchel in one hand and a letter in the other. The letter had been read so many times that the creases threatened to tear through the careful script. Sincerely, Luke. That's how he'd signed every correspondence over the past 4 months. Never with affection, never yours truly, just sincerely, Luke. Should have been a warning sign. The wind picked up, carrying dust and the scent of distant rain. Clara's dark hair, pinned carefully that morning, had already begun to escape its constraints. She'd worn her best dress, a deep green cotton that had seen better days but still held its color. First impressions mattered, even in arranged marriages. Especially in arranged marriages. "That'll be the 340 from Bismarck," Old Tom wheezed from his post by the ticket window. He'd been the station master for 30 years and had seen every kind of arrival the territory could offer. "You meeting that mail order fellow?" Clara's jaw tightened. "Mr. Holbrook is my intended husband, yes." "Humph." Old Tom spat tobacco juice onto the platform. "Dangerous business, marrying a man you never met. Could be anybody stepping off that train." "Could be a murderer," Clara's mind supplied unhelpfully. "Could be a drunk. Could be cruel. But he'd written beautiful letters, thoughtful, measured responses to her careful questions. He'd sent money for the wedding license. He'd promised a home with 4 walls and a roof that didn't leak. He'd offered partnership, not poetry, and that had seemed honest enough. The train whistle shrieked across the plains, and Clara's heart lurched into her throat. The locomotive appeared first as a dark smudge against the horizon, then grew into a thundering beast of iron and steam. It pulled into the station with a hiss and groan of brakes, and suddenly Clara couldn't breathe. The corset she'd laced too tight that morning seemed to be crushing her ribs. She smoothed her skirt with trembling hands and tried to arrange her face into something welcoming. The passenger car doors opened. A businessman emerged first, followed by a woman with 2 small children. Then a young couple, clearly newlyweds by the way they couldn't stop touching each other. Clara's eyes scanned desperately for someone who might be Luke, 32 years old, over 6 feet tall, dark hair, formerly of Missouri. And then she saw him. He was the last to step down, and he moved with a careful deliberation that made him seem older than his years. Tall. Yes, definitely over 6 feet. Broad-shouldered beneath a simple brown coat that had been mended at the elbows. Dark hair that needed cutting, touching his collar. But it was his face that made Clara's breath catch. Not because he was handsome, though he was in a rough, weathered way, but because of the absolute stillness in his expression. Their eyes met across 20 feet of platform, and Clara knew with sudden, terrible certainty that something was wrong. Luke Holbrook approached slowly, carrying a single battered trunk on his shoulder as if it weighed nothing. His eyes were a startling blue-gray, like storm clouds over the plains, and they fixed on Clara with an intensity that made her want to step back. But she held her ground, chin lifted, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. He set down the trunk, removed his hat, and just looked at her. "Mr. Holbrook?" Clara's voice came out smaller than she'd intended. "I'm Clara Whitmore. I've been expecting you." He nodded, a single deliberate movement of his head, but he didn't speak. Clara waited. The silence stretched out, broken only by the hiss of the cooling train and Old Tom's curious shuffling behind her. Heat crept up her neck. Perhaps he was shy? Some men were, she'd heard, when first meeting their brides. I hope your journey wasn't too difficult," she tried again. "The trains can be terribly uncomfortable." Another nod. His eyes never left her face, but there was something in them now. Not coldness, but a kind of resignation that made Clara's stomach twist. Are you... She swallowed hard. Are you going to say something? Luke's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Then, moving with careful deliberation, he reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small notebook and a pencil worn down to a stub. He opened the notebook to a page that had clearly been prepared in advance and turned it toward her. Clara read the words written there, and her entire world tilted sideways. I cannot speak. I should have told you in the letters, but I was afraid you wouldn't come. I'm sorry for the deception. If you want to call off the arrangement, I'll understand and pay for your return train ticket. Luke. The platform seemed to sway beneath Clara's feet. She read the words again, certain she must have misunderstood. But no. There they were. In that same careful script she'd come to know from his letters. Luke Holbrook, the man she'd agreed to marry, the man who'd written her such thoughtful correspondence about partnership and building a life together, couldn't speak. You can't... She struggled to process it. You mean you've lost your voice temporarily? An illness? Luke's expression grew grimmer. He shook his head and wrote again, faster this time. Born this way. I can hear perfectly. I can read and write. But I'll never speak. Clara's mind reeled. A mute husband. She'd come all this way, burned her last bridges, spent her final dollars on a new dress, and hope. And her mail-order husband was mute. The whispers would be unbearable. The pitying looks from the townspeople. The assumption that she'd been duped, that she'd settled for damaged goods. Miss Whitmore? Old Tom called from behind her. Everything all right there? Clara turned to see the station master watching with undisguised curiosity, and beyond him, several townspeople who'd gathered to witness the arrival of Redemption's newest resident. Mrs. Henderson from the general store, the Yates brothers who ran the livery, Sarah Chen, whose laundry business kept her in everybody's gossip, all of them watching, waiting to see what Clara would do. She turned back to Luke, and for the first time she really looked at him, beyond the shock, beyond her own disappointment. His hands, she noticed, were scarred and calloused, working hands. His clothes were clean but worn, patched carefully in multiple places. The notebook he held was small and precious, clearly used sparingly. And his eyes held a wariness that spoke of a lifetime of rejection. He expected this, she realized with a start. He expected me to turn away, and she wanted to. God help her, she wanted to climb on that train and disappear back into whatever life she could scrape together in the East. But the truth was cold and simple. She had nowhere else to go. The boarding house where she'd spent the last 2 weeks had taken her final money. Her sister had made it clear that Clara's presence would strain her marriage. There were no jobs for single women in Redemption beyond the saloon, and Clara would sooner starve than work there. But it was more than desperation that stilled her feet. It was something in Luke's face, not pity-seeking, not manipulative, just honest. He'd deceived her, yes, but he'd also given her a choice. He'd offered to pay for her return. Most men in his position would have hidden the truth until after the vows, when it would be too late for her to escape. Clara took a deep breath and made a decision that would change everything. Mr. Holbrook, she said, her voice steadier now, I came here to marry a partner, not a poet. You wrote to me about a home that needs tending, a farm that needs running, a life that needs building. Can you still offer those things? Luke's eyes widened slightly. He nodded once, emphatically. Then we have an agreement. Clara held out her hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Luke shook it. His grip was warm and strong, and Clara felt the roughness of old scars against her palm. Though I'll expect honesty from now on, no more secrets. Luke's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close, and he nodded again. He picked up his trunk, offered Clara his free arm, and together they walked off the platform and into their uncertain future. Behind them, Clara heard Mrs. Henderson's scandalized whisper, Did you see? The man can't even speak. What kind of marriage will that be? Clara's spine stiffened, but she kept walking. She'd show them all exactly what kind of marriage it would be. The wagon ride to Luke's farm took 40 minutes along a rutted dirt road that wound through prairie grass already greening with spring growth. Luke drove with the same quiet competence he seemed to bring to everything, his eyes scanning the horizon constantly, reading the land in ways Clara didn't yet understand. She tried several times to start a conversation before remembering that it would be entirely one-sided. The silence felt oppressive, heavy with all the questions she wanted to ask. Finally, frustrated, she said, "I'll need to learn to stop expecting responses, won't I?" Luke glanced at her, and one corner of his mouth lifted slightly. He couldn't drive the wagon and write simultaneously, but something in his expression suggested amusement. It irritated Clara immensely. "It's not funny," she said sharply. This is going to be very difficult." Luke's half-smile faded. He nodded once, serious now, and Clara felt a stab of guilt. This wasn't easy for him either. She needed to remember that. The farm, when it finally came into view, was smaller than Clara had imagined, but more substantial than she'd feared. The house was a simple rectangular structure with a covered porch, the wood weathered gray but solid-looking. A barn stood 30 yards away, and beyond that she could see a chicken coop, a small corral with 2 horses, and fields that had been prepared for planting. "It's nice," Clara said, meaning it. She'd half expected a soddy or a shack. This was a real home. Luke helped her down from the wagon, his hands steady at her waist, and for a moment they stood too close. Clara caught the scent of soap and leather and something earthy she couldn't name. His eyes were very blue up close, framed by sun creases that suggested he smiled more than she'd yet witnessed. Then he stepped back, picked up her satchel and his trunk, and led her inside. The interior was surprising. Clara had expected bachelor chaos, dirt floors, unwashed dishes, general disorder. Instead, she found swept wooden floors, simple but sturdy furniture, and honest-to-God curtains in the windows. The fireplace was clean, the dishes washed and stacked. Everything had its place. "You did all this yourself?" Clara asked, then felt foolish. Who else would have done it? Luke set down her things and moved to the kitchen area, where he'd clearly prepared for her arrival. There was bread on the counter and a pot of something that smelled like stew warming over the fire. He'd even picked wildflowers, just a handful of prairie roses in a mason jar on the table. Clara's throat tightened unexpectedly. These were the gestures of a man trying his best to make her welcome, working with the limited means available to him. It was more than her father had done when her mother had arrived as a young bride. Luke pulled out a chair for her, then handed her his notebook. He'd already written a new message. "You must be hungry and tired. I made stew. It's not fancy, but it's hot. Your room is there." He pointed to a door off the main room. "I'll sleep in the barn until after the wedding. The ceremony is set for Saturday at the church. That gives you 3 days to change your mind." Clara read it twice. "You're giving me an escape route." Luke nodded and wrote again. "You should have one. Marriage is permanent." "Not if I want to be ruined in the eyes of every decent person from here to Philadelphia," Clara said dryly, but she appreciated the gesture, even if it was impractical. "No, Mr. Holbrook, we've made an agreement. I keep my word." Luke studied her for a long moment, then wrote one more line. "Call me Luke, and thank you." That night, alone in a narrow but clean bedroom with real glass in the window, Clara lay awake staring at the ceiling. From outside, she could hear the night sounds of the prairie, crickets and distant coyotes, and the whisper of wind through grass. It should have been soothing, but her mind wouldn't quiet. She'd agreed to marry a man who couldn't speak, who couldn't tell her good morning or good night, who couldn't call for help if he was injured, who couldn't defend her with words if someone insulted her in town. What would their life look like? How would they manage the 1,000 small conversations that made up a marriage? And yet, she thought of those wildflowers on the table, the clean floors, the way Luke had written, "I can work, I can listen. I hope that's enough." There was a humility in those words that touched something in Clara she hadn't known was still tender. Maybe it would be enough. It would have to be. The next 3 days passed in a strange, suspended way. Clara threw herself into learning the rhythms of Luke's farm, partly to be useful and partly to avoid thinking too hard about Saturday's ceremony. She fed the chickens, gathered eggs, learned which horse was temperamental and which was gentle. She baked bread using Luke's well-stocked pantry and was surprised to find he had good supplies: flour, sugar, even coffee, which was expensive. Luke worked from dawn until dusk, always moving, always productive. He plowed the south field for corn, repaired a section of fence, fixed a loose board on the porch, and he was patient with Clara's constant questions, writing short answers in his notebook or occasionally acting things out with exaggerated gestures that made her laugh despite herself. She learned that he'd come to Dakota Territory 5 years ago from Missouri, where his family had a farm. He'd saved every penny to buy his own land, determined to prove that his silence didn't make him useless. He was 32, had no other family alive, and had decided on a mail-order marriage because, as he wrote bluntly, "No woman in Missouri would look at me twice. At least this way, you knew you were getting a farmer, if not a talker." "That's sad," Clara said when she read that. Luke shrugged, but his eyes were shadowed. He wrote, "It's honest." Clara found herself watching him more than she'd intended. The way his hands moved with such confidence when he worked, the care he took with the animals, speaking to them in a voice that existed only in his expression and touch. The morning she found him feeding an injured bird, fashioning a tiny splint for its wing. With infinite patience, something shifted in her chest. Friday evening, the day before the wedding, Clara sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. Luke came to sit beside her, and for several minutes they just existed in companionable silence. It occurred to Clara that silence wasn't actually absence, it was its own kind of presence, and Luke had learned to fill it with attention. Finally, he pulled out his notebook and wrote, "Are you afraid of tomorrow?" Clara considered lying, then decided on honesty. "Yes." "Aren't you?" Luke nodded. He wrote, "I'm afraid I won't be enough, that you'll regret this." "I'm afraid of the same thing," Clara admitted, "that I'll disappoint you, that this will be, lonely." Luke's hand moved across the page. "Then we're equally terrified." "That's a start." Despite everything, Clara laughed. "I suppose it is." Luke turned toward her, his expression serious, and wrote one more line. "I promise to work hard, to be honest with you, and to listen, really listen, to everything you say. I can't give you words, but I can give you attention." "Is that worth anything?" Clara looked at this man who'd been dealt such a difficult hand by life, and had responded not with bitterness, but with persistence, who kept his home clean and his animals fed and his fences mended, who'd given her choices when he could have trapped her, who wrote to her with such careful thought, making every word count because he couldn't afford to waste them. "Yes," she said softly. "Luke, I think it might be worth everything." But Saturday dawned clear and warm, a rare gift from the Dakota Territory. Clara dressed in her green dress, still her best, still worn, and pinned her hair up with extra care. Her hands shook only a little. In the mirror, she looked pale, but determined. The ceremony was held at the small white church on Redemption's main street. Pastor Williams had a kind face and asked no uncomfortable questions, though his wife stared at Luke with undisguised curiosity throughout the brief service. A few townspeople attended out of either genuine good wishes or morbid interest. Clara couldn't tell which. When Pastor Williams asked Luke to repeat his vows, there was an awkward pause. Then Clara, thinking quickly, said, "Pastor, my husband has prepared his vows in writing. May he present them that way?" The pastor looked uncertain, but nodded. Luke pulled out a page from his notebook, clearly prepared ahead of time, and handed it to the pastor to read aloud. "I, Luke Holbrook, take you, Clara Whitmore, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to provide for you, to protect you, to honor you with my actions when I cannot honor you with words. I promise to listen to you, to value your thoughts, and to build a life with you based on honesty and partnership. I make this vow before God and these witnesses, and I will keep it until my last breath." Clara's eyes stung. The vows were simple but profound, and somehow, written in Luke's careful hand and read by the pastor, they felt more real than any spoken words could have been. When it was her turn, she spoke her vows directly to Luke, looking into those storm-cloud eyes. "I, Clara Whitmore, take you, Luke Holbrook, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to stand beside you, to speak for both of us when needed, to listen not just to words but to all the ways you communicate. I promise to build this life with you as true partners. I make this vow freely and will honor it all my days." "Then by the power vested in me," Pastor Williams intoned,
I now pronounce you husband and wife. Luke, you may kiss your bride." Luke's eyes widened slightly. Clearly, he hadn't thought that far ahead. Clara's heart hammered as he leaned down slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. His lips brushed hers softly, briefly, and she caught again that scent of soap and leather and spring rain. It wasn't passionate, but it was gentle, and that seemed right for this beginning. When they pulled apart, Clara was surprised to see something like wonder in Luke's expression, as if he hadn't quite believed this would happen. They signed the marriage certificate, Luke's signature bold and sure, and suddenly Clara was Mrs. Holbrook, married to a man who would never say her name aloud, but who'd promised to listen to everything she said. The wedding breakfast was held at the boarding house where Clara had stayed, arranged by the landlady, Mrs. Murphy, who was sentimental about love in any form. A few neighbors joined, some out of kindness, others clearly to get a better look at the odd couple, as Clara heard someone whisper. Mrs. Henderson from the general store approached with a too-sweet smile. "Well, Mrs. Holbrook, you're a braver woman than I. How ever will you manage with a husband who can't even say I love you?" Clara felt Luke stiffen beside her, but before she could respond, old Tom, the station master, cut in gruffly. "My Martha was deaf as a post her last 15 years. We managed just fine. Love ain't about the talking, it's about the doing. And I've seen Luke Holbrook's farm. He's a damn good doer." "Language, Thomas." Mrs. Henderson gasped, but she retreated, and Clara shot old Tom a grateful look. After an hour of stilted socializing, Luke caught Clara's eye and tilted his head toward the door. A question. She nodded gratefully, and they made their escape. The wagon ride home was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet now. They were married. Whatever came next, they would face it together. As they pulled up to the house, Clara noticed something new. Luke had built a small bench on the porch, positioned to face the sunset. When he helped her down from the wagon, he led her to it and pulled out his notebook. "I made this for us, for evening conversations. I thought, we should have a place that's ours." Clara sat down on the bench, running her hand over the smooth wood. He'd sanded it carefully, made sure there would be no splinters. Another small gesture, another way of speaking without words. "It's perfect," she said. "Luke, it's perfect." He sat beside her, and they watched the sun sink toward the horizon. Clara's hand rested on the bench between them, and after a moment Luke's hand covered it, tentative, asking permission. She turned her palm up and laced her fingers through his. They sat like that until the stars came out. Two people learning the language of silence together, and Clara thought that maybe, just maybe, she'd found something more valuable than words. She'd found someone who knew how to listen. And in the vast, quiet expanse of the Dakota Territory, that was worth more than all the poetry in the world. The first week of marriage passed in a blur of adjustment and awkward discoveries. Clara learned that Luke woke before dawn every morning, moving through the house like a ghost so as not to disturb her. She learned that he took his coffee black and strong, that he had a sweet tooth for molasses cookies, and that he couldn't abide waste of any kind. Every scrap of food was saved, every broken tool repaired rather than replaced, every penny accounted for in a ledger he kept with meticulous care. What surprised Clara most was how loud silence could be. In her father's house, there had always been noise. Her father's booming voice, the clatter of the store, customers coming and going. Here, the quiet pressed in from all sides, broken only by the creak of floorboards, the pop of the fire, and Clara's own voice, which she found herself using more than ever just to fill the emptiness. "I think the hens are laying better since I started talking to them," she announced one morning over breakfast, desperate to make conversation. "The brown one especially, I've named her Henrietta. She gave me 2 eggs yesterday. Isn't that remarkable?" Luke looked up from his oatmeal, his eyes crinkling at the corners in what Clara had learned was his version of a smile. He reached for his notebook, which lived permanently on the table now, and wrote, "The chickens appreciate having a woman around. They were lonely with just me." "Were you lonely?" The question slipped out before Clara could stop it. Luke's hand paused over the page. He considered for a long moment before writing. "Yes, very. But I got used to it." "You shouldn't have to get used to loneliness," Clara said softly. Luke's response came slower this time. "Better to be lonely by yourself than lonely in a crowd. I tried living in town once.
People either talked too loud and slow at me like I was simple or ignored me completely. Here, at least the animals don't pity me. Clara's chest tightened. She'd seen those looks in town during their brief wedding breakfast. The way people's eyes slid over Luke as if he were invisible, or worse, the exaggerated gestures some made, shouting unnecessarily as if his silence meant he was deaf or stupid. "I don't pity you," she said firmly. "I may not understand your life yet, but I don't pity you." Luke met her eyes, and something passed between them, a fragile thread of understanding. He wrote, "Thank you. That means more than you know." The days settled into a rhythm. Clara took over the house and the chickens, the cooking and the cleaning and the endless mending. Luke worked the fields with a determination that bordered on obsessive, preparing the soil for corn and wheat, repairing equipment, tending to the 2 horses, a mare named Dolly and a gelding called Buck. He was, Clara had to admit, an excellent farmer. The kind of man who read the sky like a book and knew exactly when to plant, when to water, when to harvest. But the nights were the hardest. They'd fall into bed exhausted, lying side by side in the darkness, and Clara would find herself acutely aware of the man breathing quietly beside her. Luke never touched her beyond what was necessary, a hand at her elbow to steady her, fingers brushing as he passed her a plate. He was unfailingly respectful, sleeping as close to his edge of the bed as possible, and Clara told herself she was grateful for this restraint. But sometimes, in the deep hours of the night, she wondered what it would be like if he reached for her. If those scarred, capable hands that handled tools and animals with such gentleness might touch her the same way. The thought made her blush even in the darkness, and she'd turn away, pressing her face into her pillow, trying not to think about the strange intimacy of sharing a bed with someone who remained, in so many ways, a stranger. 2 weeks after the wedding, Clara made her first solo trip into town for supplies. Luke had offered to come, but she'd insisted on going alone, partly because he had work to do, and partly because she needed to establish herself as a person separate from Luke's mute husband, or that poor woman who married the silent man. The general store was busy when she arrived, filled with the usual Saturday crowd. Mrs. Henderson presided over the counter like a queen, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "Well, if it isn't Mrs. Holbrook," she announced loudly, and Clara felt every head in the store turn toward her. "How is married life treating you, dear? Managing all right?" "Very well, thank you," Clara said crisply, pulling out her list. "I need flour, sugar, yeast, and coffee, please." Of course, of course." Mrs. Henderson bustled about gathering items, but her mouth kept moving. "It must be so quiet out at that farm. Don't you get lonely with no one to talk to?" "My husband and I communicate just fine," Clara said, keeping her voice level. "Oh, I'm sure you do, dear. But it's not the same as real conversation, is it? A woman needs words." Mrs. Henderson's tone was sympathetic, but her eyes were avid with curiosity. "My Harold talks my ear off most days, but I'd rather that than silence." Clara felt her temper rising but forced it down. "Luke listens better than any man I've ever known. That's worth more than empty chatter." "If you say so, dear." Mrs. Henderson clearly didn't believe it. "Though I do wonder, how will you manage when there are children? A father needs to be able to speak to his—" "Excuse me," a voice cut in. Clara turned to see Sarah Chen, the woman who ran the laundry business. She was Chinese-American, and Clara had heard whispers about her own unconventional story. Something about a grandmother who'd come over with railroad workers and refused to leave when everyone expected her to. "Mrs. Holbrook, I wanted to thank your husband for fixing my wagon wheel last month. He wouldn't accept payment, but it saved me considerable expense." "Oh," Clara said, surprised. "I didn't know about that." "He's a good man," Sarah said firmly, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Helps people without being asked, doesn't gossip, keeps his word. Those are rare qualities. You're lucky to have him." "Thank you," Clara managed, feeling a rush of gratitude toward this woman she barely knew. "I think I am lucky." Mrs. Henderson sniffed disapprovingly, but wrapped Clara's purchases in silence. As Clara paid and gathered her parcels, she became aware of other eyes on her, some sympathetic, some judgmental, all curious. The weight of their attention made her skin prickle. Outside, loading her purchases into the wagon, Clara was approached by a young woman she recognized vaguely from church. Pretty, blonde, couldn't have been more than 19. Mrs. Holbrook? The girl twisted her hands nervously. I'm Emma Yates. My brothers run the livery. Yes, I remember. Hello, Emma. I just wanted to say... Emma glanced around as if checking for eavesdroppers. Mr. Holbrook, Luke, he was kind to me once when I was younger. Some boys were teasing me, saying cruel things, and he didn't say anything, of course, but he stood there until they left. He made sure I got home safe. She blushed. I always thought he was a good man, better than most who talk too much and say nothing worth hearing. Clara found herself smiling. Thank you for telling me that. Emma nodded and hurried away, and Clara climbed onto the wagon seat, feeling somehow lighter. Luke had a history here, had built a quiet reputation through actions rather than words. It mattered to know that. The ride home took her past the open prairie, and Clara found herself thinking about what Mrs. Henderson had said. About children. They hadn't discussed it, hadn't discussed much of anything important, really. They'd been too busy figuring out how to exist together day by day. But eventually, that conversation would need to happen. Eventually, this marriage would need to become something more than two people sharing space and silence. The thought made her nervous and uncertain in ways she couldn't quite name. When she arrived home, she found Luke in the barn, grooming Dolly with long, patient strokes. He looked up when Clara's shadow fell across the doorway, and his whole face changed, softened, warmed. It was remarkable how expressive he could be without words once you learned to look. I'm back, Clara announced unnecessarily. Sarah Chen says thank you for fixing her wagon wheel. You didn't mention that. Luke shrugged and reached for the notebook he kept in his shirt pocket. It was nothing, just a loose spoke. It wasn't nothing to her, Clara said. Emma Yates also spoke to me. She remembered you being kind to her. Luke looked uncomfortable, ducking his head as he returned to brushing the mare. Clara watched him work for a moment, then gathered her courage. Luke, can we talk tonight? Really talk, I mean, about things. His hand stilled on the brush. He turned to face her fully, his expression cautious but open. He nodded once. Good, Clara said, though her stomach fluttered nervously. Good. I'll make supper. That evening, after the dishes were washed and put away, they sat together on the porch bench Luke had built. The sun was setting in streaks of gold and crimson, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called to its pack. Clara twisted her hands in her lap, trying to find the right words. I've been thinking about what people in town said today. About our marriage. About how we manage. Luke pulled out his notebook, but Clara stopped him with a hand on his arm. Just listen first. Please. He nodded, giving her his full attention in that intense way he had. I know this isn't a love match, Clara continued. We both entered into this as a practical arrangement, but we're married now, and I think we need to decide what kind of marriage we want this to be. Are we partners? Friends? Just two people sharing space? Luke considered this, then wrote carefully. What do you want us to be? I don't know yet, Clara admitted, but I know I don't want us to be strangers who happen to live in the same house. I want to understand you better, and I want you to understand me. Luke's pen moved again. Ask me anything. Clara took a breath. The letters you wrote to me, they were so thoughtful. How did you learn to write like that? Luke's expression grew distant with memory. He wrote slowly. My mother taught me. She was a school teacher before she married my father. When she realized I couldn't speak, she made sure I could read and write better than anyone. She said if words were my only voice, I needed to make them count. She died when I was 12. I'm sorry, Clara whispered. What about your father? The pen scratched harshly across the page. He was ashamed of me. Thought I was cursed or punishment for his sins. He barely looked at me after Mother died. When I was old enough, I left. Haven't seen him since. Clara's heart ached for the boy Luke must have been, voiceless in a world that valued nothing so much as a man's ability to speak loudly and command attention. That must have been terribly lonely. It was, Luke wrote, but it taught me to be self-sufficient and to appreciate people who see past the silence. Is that why you chose a mail-order marriage? Because a woman who agreed to marry a stranger might be more willing to look past things? Luke's mouth quirked. Partly. Also because no woman in Missouri would look at me twice. I'm not handsome enough to make up for being mute, and I have no family fortune. At least this way I could offer land and a home. Something concrete. You are handsome, Clara said, then blushed furiously. I mean, you're not unpleasant to look at. That's not the issue. Luke's eyebrows rose and his eyes held unmistakable amusement. He wrote, Thank you. You're not unpleasant to look at either. Despite her embarrassment, Clara laughed. Well, I'm glad we've established that we can both tolerate each other's faces. They sat in companionable silence for a moment. Then Luke wrote again. My turn to ask questions? Fair enough. Why did you agree to this? To marrying a stranger and coming to Dakota Territory? Clara had known this question would come eventually. She stared out at the darkening prairie, gathering her thoughts. My father died 2 years ago. He'd kept our debts hidden from me. Thought he'd be able to fix things before I found out. But when he died, the creditors came immediately. We lost the store, the house, everything. My sister Eliza had already married a merchant in Philadelphia. He let me stay with them for a while, but she swallowed hard. He made it clear I was a burden. Eliza was caught in the middle. I couldn't stay. Luke's hand covered hers on the bench, a gesture of comfort. I tried to find work, Clara continued, but there's not much available for unmarried women without family. Teaching requires certificates I don't have. Factory work is dangerous and pays almost nothing. The only other options were... She didn't need to finish that sentence. When I saw your advertisement, it seemed like a chance to have a home again, to be useful instead of pitied, even if it meant marrying a stranger. Luke wrote, Do you regret it? Clara considered the question honestly. I regret that you weren't truthful in your letters. I regret that I don't know how this will work yet. But do I regret being here, having a roof over my head, having purpose? No, I don't regret that. That's not exactly a ringing endorsement of matrimony. It's honest, Clara said, echoing his words from days earlier. I think we owe each other honesty, don't we? Luke nodded. He wrote one more line. I'll try to be the husband you deserve, even if I can't be the one you wanted. Luke, Clara turned to face him fully. I didn't want anyone. I needed security, and you offered it. Maybe that's not romantic, but it's true. And now that I'm here, I'd like to try to build something real, not just security, but partnership, maybe even friendship. Luke's eyes searched her face in the fading light. Then he wrote, I'd like that too, more than I can say. The irony of that last phrase hung between them for a moment before they both smiled. Sad, understanding smiles that acknowledged the strange reality of their situation. We're quite a pair, aren't we? Clara said softly. A woman with nowhere else to go and a man no one else would take. Luke shook his head and wrote firmly, a woman brave enough to start over and a man patient enough to wait for someone worth waiting for. Clara's throat tightened. That's a kinder way to put it. It's a truer way. They sat together until the stars emerged, neither speaking or not speaking, just existing in each other's presence. And Clara thought that maybe this was what marriage could be, not grand passion or constant conversation, but this quiet acceptance, this willingness to sit beside someone and let the silence be companionable rather than lonely. It wasn't what she dreamed of as a girl, but then again, girlhood dreams rarely survived contact with reality. This was what she had: a farm on the prairie, a husband who couldn't speak but who listened with his entire being, and a future that remained uncertain but possible. For now, that was enough. The following weeks brought spring in earnest, and with it, a deluge of work. The fields needed planting, the garden needed tending, the chickens seemed determined to escape their coop at every opportunity, and the roof developed a leak during a torrential rainstorm that had Luke up at midnight trying to patch it, while Clara held the ladder and worried he'd break his neck. Through it all, they developed their own peculiar rhythm of communication. Clara learned to read Luke's gestures. A tilt of his head meant he was listening closely. A particular set to his shoulders meant he was frustrated. A softening around his eyes meant he was pleased. Luke, in turn, seemed to anticipate Clara's needs before she voiced them, appearing with water when she was thirsty from garden work, mending her favorite shawl without being asked, leaving small gifts he'd carved from wood, a spoon, a comb, a bird in flight.
You don't have to keep making me things, Clara told him one evening, holding up a beautifully carved hairpin he'd left on her pillow. Luke's response was immediate. I like making you things. Let me. Why? He thought for a long moment before writing. Because I can't tell you with words that I'm glad you're here. So I tell you with my hands. Clara traced the delicate carving of a rose on the hairpin, her eyes stinging. Luke Holbrook, you're going to make me cry, and I'm not a woman who cries easily. His mouth quirked, but his eyes were serious. You're allowed to cry. I won't judge you for it. That's good, because these past few weeks have been, she searched for the right word, surprisingly nice.
Exhausting and frustrating and harder than I expected, but nice. You're a good man. Luke ducked his head, clearly uncomfortable with the praise, and changed the subject by pointing to the vegetables sprouting in the garden, a clear invitation to discuss something less emotionally fraught. Clara let him deflect, but she filed away the moment in her memory. Luke didn't accept compliments easily, she'd learned. Criticism rolled off him. He'd endured too much of it to be wounded by it now, but genuine appreciation seemed to undo him completely. She wondered how long it had been since anyone had told him he was good at something, worth something, worthy of being valued. In early May, 3 weeks after the wedding, they attended Sunday services together for the first time since becoming husband and wife. Clara had been dreading it, the whispers, the stares, the inevitable questions about how they were managing. But Luke had written that it was important for people to see them as a united front, and Clara had to agree. The service itself was unremarkable. Pastor Williams preached about patience and faith, and the congregation sang hymns while Luke stood silent beside Clara, holding the hymnal even though he couldn't join in. She felt his presence like a warm, solid wall at her side, protective, steady. After the service, as they made their way toward the wagon, they were intercepted by a tall man with silver-streaked hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Holbrook, the man said curtly, not quite a greeting. His eyes barely acknowledged Clara's existence. Heard you're growing corn this season. Hope you know what you're doing. Last thing we need is amateur farming driving down everyone's yield. Luke's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He pulled out his notebook, but the man, whoever he was, didn't wait. Can't hear you if you write, can I? Should have stuck to what you know instead of trying to expand. He walked away without another word, leaving Clara seething. Who was that insufferable man? She demanded. Luke wrote grimly, Robert Crenshaw. Owns the largest farm in the county. Thinks that makes him everyone's superior. He's horrible. He's always been horrible, especially to me. Why? Luke hesitated, then wrote, When I first came to Redemption, I worked for him for a season. He discovered I couldn't speak and decided that meant he could pay me half wages. When I protested in writing, he tore up my contract and told me no one would believe a mute anyway. Said I should be grateful anyone gave me work at all. Clara felt rage bubble up in her chest. That's theft. That's legal, Luke wrote. Or close enough. His word against mine, and I can't speak in my own defense. That's not right. Luke's smile was bitter. No, but it's reality. They drove home in tense silence, Clara fuming on Luke's behalf, while he seemed resigned to the injustice. But that evening, as they sat on their porch, Clara made a decision. I'm going to learn, she announced. Luke looked up from the piece of wood he was carving, questioning. I'm going to learn everything about farming, Clara clarified. Crop rotation, soil conditions, weather patterns, market prices, all of it, so that when men like Crenshaw try to dismiss you, I can speak for both of us. With facts and knowledge they can't argue with. Luke stared at her for a long moment, something complicated crossing his face. Then he wrote, You'd do that? I'm your wife, Clara said simply. If people won't hear you, they'll have to hear me, and I'll make sure they know every word comes from your knowledge and your work. Luke set down his carving and his notebook, then did something unexpected. He reached out and pulled Clara into an embrace. It was the first time he'd initiated physical contact beyond necessary touches, and Clara stiffened in surprise before relaxing into it. He smelled like sawdust and soap and something indefinably Luke. His arms were strong around her, and she could feel his heart beating against her cheek. When he finally released her, his eyes were bright with emotion. He wrote quickly, Thank you. You didn't have to offer that. Yes, I did,
Clara said firmly. We're partners, remember? That means facing things together. That night, lying in bed with Luke's breathing steady beside her in the darkness, Clara realized something had shifted between them. They weren't strangers anymore. They weren't quite friends or lovers or whatever married couples were supposed to be. But they were something growing, something real. And Clara found herself hoping, for the first time since she'd stepped off that train, that this strange marriage might become something worth having. Not just for survival or security, but for its own sake. In the morning, Luke began teaching her everything he knew about farming, writing long, detailed explanations in his notebook while Clara took notes and asked endless questions. She learned about crop rotation and pest management, about reading the sky for weather patterns, about the delicate balance of planting too early versus too late. Luke was a patient teacher, never making her feel foolish for not knowing things, always willing to explain multiple times until she understood. And Clara discovered she had a natural aptitude for the work. Her father's head for numbers translated well to calculating crop yields and market projections, and her careful attention to detail served her well in learning the subtle signs of plant disease or soil depletion. I think Henrietta is broody, Clara announced one morning at breakfast, referring to her favorite hen. She's been sitting on the same nest for 3 days and pecks at me when I try to collect eggs. Luke nodded and wrote, Leave her. We could use more chickens. How long does it take? About 3 weeks. She'll hatch them on her own. Just make sure she has food and water nearby so she doesn't have to leave the nest long. Clara made a note of this in her own notebook. She'd started keeping one to track everything she learned. And then we'll have baby chickens? Chicks, Luke corrected gently. If all goes well, yes. This is rather exciting, Clara said, surprising herself. A few months ago, she'd been living in Philadelphia, helping her sister manage a household, dreaming of nothing more ambitious than perhaps securing a position as a governess. Now she was learning to farm, tending chickens, planning crop yields. It was exhausting and occasionally overwhelming, but it was also engaging. She mattered here in a way she hadn't mattered in years. Luke was watching her with that expression she'd come to recognize, pleased and a little surprised, as if he kept expecting her to regret this life, and was grateful when she didn't. What? Clara asked. He wrote, You're blooming out here, like the prairie roses. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. That's rather poetic for a farmer. I contain multitudes, Luke wrote, and his eyes crinkled with humor. Yes, Clara said softly. You do. The moment stretched between them, charged with something Clara couldn't quite name. Then Luke cleared his throat, a sound she heard so rarely it startled her, and stood to gather his tools for the day's work. But as he passed Clara's chair, his hand brushed her shoulder, a fleeting touch that might have been accidental but felt deliberate. Clara sat very still, feeling the warmth of that brief contact long after he'd gone outside. Things were changing between them, slowly, cautiously, like spring creeping across the frozen prairie, but definitely, undeniably changing. And for the first time since agreeing to this arrangement, Clara found herself wondering what it would be like if this marriage became something more than convenient. If Luke's silence and her words could somehow weave together into something resembling happiness. The thought both terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. The shift in their relationship became more evident as May deepened into June. Clara caught herself watching Luke more often, the way his muscles moved beneath his shirt when he lifted fence posts, the concentration on his face when he carved in the evenings, the gentleness in his hands when he treated a cut on her finger after she'd sliced it washing dishes. He'd held her hand so carefully, cleaning the wound with whiskey that stung, wrapping it in clean cloth with movements that were almost tender. His eyes had met hers, and Clara had felt something flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with the pain. You're very good at this, she'd murmured, and Luke had written quickly, I've had to take care of myself for a long time. You learn. Well, I'm grateful you learned, Clara had said, and Luke's ears had turned red in a way she was beginning to find endearing. They fell into evening routines that felt almost like courtship, though Clara wasn't sure if that was what they were doing. After supper, they'd sit on the porch bench, and Clara would read aloud from books Luke had carefully collected. Shakespeare, Dickens, Whitman. Luke would carve while she read, his knife moving in steady strokes, creating birds and flowers and abstract shapes that seemed to reflect whatever emotion the story stirred in him.
Do you have a favorite? Clara asked one evening, closing a volume of poetry. Luke thought for a moment, then wrote, Whitman, I sing the body electric, the way he finds divinity in ordinary things. Read me your favorite part, Clara said, then caught herself. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't think... But Luke was already flipping through the book, finding the page and pointing to a passage. Clara read it aloud. If anything is sacred, the human body is sacred. She looked up to find Luke watching her intently. Why this part? He wrote slowly, choosing words carefully. Because people like me, we're often treated as if our bodies betray us, as if being unable to speak makes us less human. But Whitman says the body itself is sacred, regardless of what it can or cannot do. I held on to that idea during hard times. Clara's throat tightened. Your body isn't a betrayal, Luke. It's just different. Tell that to the people who treated me like I was cursed, he wrote, but without bitterness now, just statement of fact. Then they're fools, Clara said fiercely. You work harder than any man I've known. You're kinder than most. You listen better than anyone with a voice ever has. If they can't see that, the lack is in them, not you. Luke stared at her, something raw and vulnerable in his expression. Then he reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture so intimate and unexpected that Clara's breath caught. His fingers lingered for just a moment at her cheek before he pulled back, looking almost shocked at his own boldness. Neither of them mentioned it, but Clara felt the warmth of that touch for hours afterward. The heat of summer arrived with a vengeance in late June, turning the prairie into a furnace. Clara learned to work in the early mornings and late evenings, resting during the brutal midday hours when even the chickens sought shade. Luke worked through it all with grim determination, coming in for meals covered in dust and sweat, his shirt clinging to him in ways that made Clara look away quickly and then, despite herself, look back. She was attracted to him. The realization had crept up on her gradually, but now it was undeniable. She noticed the breadth of his shoulders, the strength in his forearms, the rare smiles that transformed his usually serious face. She found herself wanting to touch him, to smooth the furrow from his brow when he was worried, to trace the scars on his hands and learn the story of each one, to discover if his hair was as soft as it looked. It was confusing and frustrating because she didn't know if Luke felt the same. He was unfailingly respectful, still sleeping as far from her as possible in their bed, never taking liberties. Sometimes she caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't read, but he always looked away quickly when noticed. One particularly sweltering afternoon, Clara was in the kitchen trying to bake bread despite the heat when Luke came in from the fields earlier than usual. She looked up to find him swaying slightly, his face flushed an alarming shade of red. "Luke?" She dropped the dough and hurried to him. "Are you all right?" He tried to pull out his notebook, but his hands were shaking. Clara guided him to a chair, alarmed by how hot his skin felt beneath her fingers. "You have heat stroke," she said, recognizing the signs from a summer when one of her father's employees had collapsed in similar fashion. "Don't try to write, just sit still." She brought cool water, made him drink it slowly, then wet a cloth and pressed it to his forehead and neck. Luke's eyes were closed, his breathing shallow. Clara knelt beside him, one hand at his wrist checking his pulse, the other holding the cloth to his burning skin. "You absolute fool," she muttered, but her voice shook with fear. "Working through the worst heat of the day. You could have died out there." Luke's eyes opened, focusing on her with effort. He tried to reach for his notebook again, but Clara stopped him. "No writing. You need to rest, just..." She hesitated, then made a decision. "Nod if you understand me." He nodded weakly. "Good. Now, can you stand? We need to get you somewhere cooler." Another nod. Clara helped him up, supporting his weight as they made their way to the bedroom. It was marginally cooler there, with the curtains drawn against the sun. She helped him onto the bed, then brought more water and cloths. For the next hour, Clara tended to him with single-minded focus, changing the cool cloths, making him drink, watching anxiously as his color slowly returned to something approaching normal. Luke drifted in and out of consciousness, and Clara found herself talking to him constantly, partly to keep him awake, partly to calm her own racing heart. "You scared me," she admitted, wringing out another cloth. "I know you're used to working alone, to pushing through everything, but you have someone else to consider now."
If something happened to you, she swallowed hard. I wouldn't just lose a husband, Luke. I'd lose my friend. And I have so few of those that I can't afford to be careless with the ones I have. Luke's hand found hers, squeezing weakly. His eyes opened, clearer now, and in them Clara saw gratitude and something else, something that made her pulse quicken. You're going to be fine, she said, more to convince herself than him. But tomorrow, you work early mornings only, and you take breaks. I don't care how much needs to be done. Luke's mouth quirked in what might have been amusement or agreement. He tugged her hand gently, and Clara understood. He wanted his notebook. She retrieved it from where it had fallen. His writing was shaky but legible. I'm sorry I worried you. Not used to having someone who'd care if I collapsed. Well, you do now, Clara said firmly. So you'd better take care of yourself, because I refuse to be widowed at 26. I'll try, he wrote. Then after a pause, thank you for taking care of me. That's what wives do, Clara said, then found herself adding softly, that's what people who care about each other do. Luke's eyes searched hers, and Clara felt the air between them shift, charged with something unspoken but powerful. She was kneeling beside the bed, still holding his hand, and Luke was looking at her like she was something precious. His free hand reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her cheek. Clara's breath hitched. Luke's thumb brushed her cheekbone with infinite gentleness, his eyes asking a question. Clara found herself leaning into the touch, her own hand coming up to cover his. They stayed like that for a long moment, the heat of the day forgotten, the only sound their breathing and the distant call of a meadowlark. Then Luke tugged her hand gently, and Clara understood. He wanted her closer. She sat on the edge of the bed, and Luke shifted to make room, never breaking eye contact. Luke, Clara whispered, not sure what she was asking. He wrote one-handed, the notebook balanced on his chest. Stay with me? Just until I fall asleep? Of course, Clara said, relieved and disappointed in equal measure. She settled beside him on top of the covers, careful to maintain some distance. But Luke shifted closer, his hand finding hers again, lacing their fingers together. They lay like that as the afternoon light slowly faded, Luke's breathing evening out as exhaustion and recovery pulled him toward sleep. Clara stayed awake, acutely aware of his warmth beside her, the calluses on his palm, the trust implicit in his vulnerability. Somewhere in the past few months, this practical arrangement had become something else entirely, and Clara was both terrified and exhilarated by the realization. She was falling in love with her silent husband, had been falling for weeks maybe, without fully acknowledging it, the way he left her small gifts, the patience with which he taught her, the careful respect he showed her, even as she caught him watching her with barely concealed longing. The steadiness of his presence, the strength of his character, the gentle way he moved through the world despite how harshly the world had treated him. When Luke finally slept, Clara carefully extracted herself and went to finish her chores. But her hands trembled as she worked, and her mind kept returning to the feeling of his fingers laced with hers, the vulnerability in his eyes, the almost question in his touch. That evening, after Luke woke and insisted he was fine, they ate a light supper in near silence. The air between them felt different, weighted with awareness and unspoken possibility. Clara caught herself stealing glances at Luke, only to find him doing the same. When their eyes met, neither looked away quickly this time. After the dishes were cleaned, they sat on the porch as usual, but the comfortable routine felt charged with tension. Clara tried to read, but the words blurred together. Beside her, Luke carved mechanically, his attention clearly elsewhere. Finally, Clara closed her book with a decisive snap. Luke, we need to talk. Really talk. He set down his carving immediately, his full attention on her. She appreciated that about him. When she spoke, he listened with his entire being. Clara took a breath, gathering courage. This arrangement we have, this marriage, it's not what either of us expected, but it's become something, at least for me. And I need to know if... She faltered, then forced herself to continue. I need to know what you're thinking, what you're feeling, because I can't keep guessing. Luke nodded slowly, then began writing in his notebook. It took several minutes, and Clara waited, her heart hammering. Finally, he turned the page toward her. I'm thinking that I'm the luckiest man in Dakota Territory.
I'm thinking that I expected a marriage of convenience and got something I never dared hope for, a partner, a friend, maybe more if I haven't misread things completely. I'm feeling grateful and terrified in equal measure because I've never had something this good, and I'm afraid I'll somehow destroy it through sheer inexperience." He paused, then wrote more. "I'm feeling things I don't have words for, Clara, and I know that's ironic given that I have no words at all. But you make me wish I could speak just so I could tell you everything." Clara's eyes stung with tears. "What would you tell me if you could?" Luke's hand moved rapidly. "That you're beautiful when you're elbow deep in garden dirt, cursing at stubborn carrots. That I love watching you read because your whole face changes with the story. That I think about you constantly when I'm in the fields. That I want to touch you all the time, but I'm afraid of presuming too much. That this marriage stopped being an arrangement for me weeks ago." "Oh," Clara breathed. "Oh, Luke." "I know I'm not what you wanted," he wrote quickly. "I know I can't give you words or romance or any of the things women are supposed to want from their husbands, but I can give you loyalty and partnership and—" "Stop," Clara interrupted, placing her hand over his, stilling the pen. "Just stop. You're giving me exactly what I need. You listen to me, Luke. You see me. You treat me like a person with thoughts and opinions that matter. You make me feel—" She searched for the right words. "You make me feel valued, respected, and yes, cared for." Luke's eyes were bright with emotion. He wrote, "Cared for?" "More than that," Clara admitted, her cheeks heating. "I'm developing feelings for you, Luke Holbrook. Real feelings. The kind that make me worried when you're in the hot sun too long. The kind that make me want to be near you even when there's work to be done. The kind that make me think about—" She couldn't quite finish that sentence. Luke's hand came up to cup her face, the same gesture he'd made earlier, but more confident now. His eyes asked permission, and Clara gave it with a small nod. He leaned in slowly, giving her every opportunity to change her mind, and pressed his lips to hers. It was nothing like the brief, formal kiss at their wedding. This was soft and searching, tentative but warm. Luke's hand slid to the back of her neck, and Clara's fingers gripped his shirt, pulling him closer. The kiss deepened, and Clara felt heat bloom through her body, want and need and affection all tangled together. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Luke rested his forehead against hers. Clara could feel him trembling slightly. "That was—" she started, then laughed breathlessly. "That was worth waiting for." Luke's smile was brilliant, transforming his whole face. He kissed her again, softer this time, then reached for his notebook with visible reluctance. "I've wanted to do that for weeks," he wrote, "but I wasn't sure if you'd want me to." "I want you to," Clara said firmly. "I want you to kiss me. I want you to touch me. I want this marriage to be real, Luke, in every way." Luke's eyes darkened with understanding and desire. He wrote, "Are you sure? We don't have to rush anything." "I'm sure," Clara said, surprising herself with her certainty. "I'm sure about you, about us. I don't know when it happened exactly, but somewhere between the chicken coop and the cornfields and your terrible coffee, I fell for you." "My coffee isn't terrible," Luke wrote, but he was smiling. "It absolutely is," Clara laughed. "But I'll teach you how to make it properly, and you can teach me." She stopped, suddenly shy. Luke's eyebrows rose questioningly. He wrote, "Teach you what?" Clara took his hand and placed it over her rapidly beating heart. "Teach me how to speak your language. Not just the practical parts, but the intimate ones. I want to learn to read you the way you read me." Luke's expression grew serious and tender at once. He wrote carefully, "That might be the most romantic thing anyone has ever said to me." "Well then, you've been associating with the wrong people," Clara said, "because you deserve romance, Luke. You deserve to be courted and desired and loved." "Loved?" Luke wrote, his hand shaking slightly. Clara met his eyes steadily. "I'm getting there. Maybe I'm already there and just too scared to say it plainly. But yes, love. I think that's what this is becoming." Luke pulled her close, burying his face in her hair, and Clara felt his chest heave with emotion. She held him tightly, understanding that this vulnerability was precious, that Luke had spent so much of his life guarding himself against rejection that opening up required courage she couldn't fully fathom. When he finally pulled back, his eyes were wet, but he was smiling. He kissed her again, and this time there was joy in it, relief and happiness and promise. They sat together as the stars emerged, kissing and touching with growing confidence, learning the geography of each other's bodies through clothes that suddenly seemed like barriers. Clara felt desire pooling low in her belly, a warmth that had nothing to do with the summer heat. Luke's hands were gentle but sure, tracing the line of her jaw, the curve of her waist, asking permission with every touch. "Come to bed," Clara finally whispered against his mouth. "Really come to bed. Not just to sleep beside each other like polite strangers." Luke pulled back to look at her searchingly, making sure she meant it. Clara held his gaze, letting him see her certainty and her want. He nodded once, then stood and offered her his hand. They walked inside together, and for the first time since their wedding night, there was no awkwardness as they prepared for bed. Luke watched as Clara unpinned her hair, and she watched him remove his shirt, revealing the muscled landscape of his chest and the scars that mapped a life of hard work. They came together in the darkness, and Clara discovered that silence could be its own language, that Luke's hands and lips could communicate everything his voice never would. He was gentle and patient, checking constantly for her comfort, moving slowly despite the desire Clara could feel thrumming through him. And Clara, who had approached her wedding night with duty-bound resignation, found herself lost in sensation and connection. The weight of Luke's body, the taste of his skin, the way his eyes never left hers, making sure she was with him every moment. Afterward, they lay tangled together, sweaty and breathless and amazed. Luke traced patterns on Clara's shoulder, and she pressed her lips to his throat, feeling his pulse beating there.
"I had no idea," she murmured. "No idea it could be like that." Luke reached for the notebook he'd left on the bedside table, even now, never far from a way to communicate. In the moonlight filtering through the window, Clara could just make out his writing. "Neither did I. I've never—" That was my first time too. Clara propped herself up on one elbow, surprised. "Really? But you're 32. "No woman ever wanted me," Luke wrote simply, "and I wasn't going to pay for something that should be freely given. I waited." "For me?" Clara's voice caught. "For someone who saw me as human. You happen to be that person." He paused, then added, "Thank God you were." Clara kissed him softly, tasting salt and sweetness. "Thank God indeed."
They fell asleep wrapped around each other, and for the first time since arriving in Dakota Territory, Clara felt completely at home. The following weeks brought a shift in their marriage that was both subtle and profound. Outwardly, little changed. They still worked from dawn to dusk, still had their evening routines on the porch, still communicated through writing and gesture. But now there was an ease between them, an intimacy that went beyond the physical. They touched constantly now, Luke's hand on Clara's back as he passed behind her, Clara's fingers in Luke's hair as they sat together in the evenings, casual kisses stolen between chores. Clara found herself smiling for no reason throughout the day, and catching Luke doing the same when he thought she wasn't watching. They made love frequently, learning each other's bodies and preferences, discovering that their different ways of communicating only made them more attuned to nuance and sensation. "I think I'm happy," Clara announced one morning at breakfast, surprising herself with the realization. "Properly happy. I didn't think I'd ever say that again after Papa died." Luke's smile was warm and knowing. He wrote, "So am I, happier than I've ever been. Even though I still make terrible biscuits, even though," Luke wrote solemnly, "your other qualities compensate." "My other qualities?" Clara raised an eyebrow. Luke's eyes glinted with mischief as he wrote, "Your chicken wrangling abilities, your determination to argue with me about crop rotation, the way you—" Clara plucked the notebook from his hands. "If the next words are anything improper, I don't want to know." Luke's silent laughter shook his shoulders, and Clara couldn't help but join in. This joy and playfulness and partnership was what she'd never expected to find. It was worth every difficult moment, every adjustment, every instance of learning to communicate across the gap of silence. In early July, they made their monthly trip into town for supplies. Clara noticed immediately that people's reactions to them had changed. Where before there had been pity or curiosity or disdain, now there was something else, perhaps respect, perhaps just the grudging acknowledgement that they'd made this strange marriage work. Sarah Chen greeted them warmly at the general store, and several people nodded politely as they passed. Even Mrs. Henderson seemed less inclined to make pointed comments, though she still watched them with avid interest. It was as they were loading supplies into the wagon that trouble found them. Robert Crenshaw appeared, flanked by two of his farmhands, and his expression was sour. "Holbrook," he said sharply, "heard you planted 20 acres of corn. That true?" Luke nodded, his body going still and watchful. Clara moved closer to his side. "That's a fool's gamble in this soil," Crenshaw continued. "You'll lose the whole crop and drag down prices for the rest of us when you fail." Clara felt anger flash through her, hot and sharp. "Mr. Holbrook has spent 5 years learning this land. He knows exactly what he's doing." Crenshaw's eyes finally acknowledged her existence, but his look was dismissive. "Mrs. Holbrook, I'm sure you mean well, but farming isn't women's work. Your husband should explain—" He paused deliberately. "Oh, wait, he can't, can he?" Clara's vision went red. "My husband communicates just fine, Mr. Crenshaw. Perhaps if you spent less time talking and more time listening, you'd learn something useful. As for the corn, Luke has prepared the soil properly, selected varieties suited to this climate, and calculated the irrigation needs down to the gallon. His crop will not only succeed, it will likely outperform yours because he approaches farming with intelligence rather than arrogance." Crenshaw's face darkened. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" Clara pulled out her own notebook. She carried one now, filled with all the information Luke had taught her. "The south field has been properly fertilized with composted manure for 2 years, building the soil quality. The corn varieties are drought-resistant strains obtained from the Agricultural Extension Office. Luke has installed a windmill-powered irrigation system that provides consistent water during dry spells. Would you like me to continue, or would you prefer to stop insulting someone who knows more about successful farming than you ever will?" There was dead silence. Several townspeople had gathered to listen, and Clara saw Sarah Chen hiding a smile. Even Crenshaw's farmhands looked impressed. Crenshaw's jaw worked. "Well, I see Holbrook has taught his wife to be as uppity as he is presumptuous." "Uppity?" Clara's voice could have cut glass. "I'm defending my husband's reputation against baseless attacks from a man too insecure to acknowledge that someone he dismissed as inferior might actually be more skilled than him." "Clara." Luke touched her arm gently, a calming gesture. But when Clara looked at him, his eyes were shining with pride and something like awe. "No," Clara said firmly. "You've been silent long enough, letting men like this speak for you, or over you, or about you. But I have a voice, Luke, and I'm going to use it. For both of us." She turned back to Crenshaw. "My husband is one of the finest farmers in this county. He works harder, plans better, and treats his land with more respect than most men I've observed. If you have a problem with his methods or his success, that's your issue, not his. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have a farm to run." She climbed onto the wagon, and Luke followed, his hand finding hers once they were settled. As they pulled away, Claire could see the gathered crowd parting, could feel their eyes following. Let them stare, let them talk. She and Luke had nothing to be ashamed of. They rode in silence for several minutes before Luke pulled the wagon to the side of the road, away from town. He turned to Clara, his expression intense, and pulled out his notebook with shaking hands. "That was the bravest thing I've ever seen," he wrote. "No one has ever defended me like that. Most people just let Crenshaw say whatever he wants because it's easier than arguing with him." "Well, I'm not most people," Clara said, still trembling with adrenaline. "And I won't let anyone diminish you, Luke. Not while I have breath in my body." Luke set down his notebook and cupped her face in both hands, his eyes blazing with emotion. He kissed her deeply, pouring everything he couldn't say into the gesture, gratitude and pride and love and wonder. When they broke apart, Clara was breathless. "I love you," she said, the words escaping before she could think better of them. "I know we haven't said it yet, but I do. I love you, Luke Holbrook. Your silence, your strength, your gentleness, your stubborn determination, all of it. I love all of it." Luke's eyes filled with tears. His hands shook as he picked up his notebook again. "I love you too, have loved you for weeks. Maybe from the moment you chose to stay instead of taking that return train ticket. You could have left, but you stayed. You gave me a chance when no one else would. How could I not love you?"
Clara launched herself at him, nearly knocking them both off the wagon seat. Luke caught her, laughing silently, his whole body shaking with it. They held each other in the middle of the prairie road, and Clara thought that this messy, unexpected, beautiful love was worth every hardship that had led her here. "We should probably go home," she said eventually, still clinging to him.
"The chickens will be wondering where we are." Luke nodded, his smile brilliant, and guided the horses back onto the road. But he kept one arm around Clara the whole way home, and she leaned into him, feeling more secure and valued than she ever had in her entire life. That night, they sat on their porch bench watching the stars emerge, and Luke carved while Clara simply watched his hands move. There was a peace between them now, hard-won and precious. "Do you ever wish you could speak?" Clara asked quietly. "I know you can't, and I'm not suggesting you should. I just wonder if you wish things were different." Luke set down his carving and thought for a long moment before writing. "Sometimes, when I want to shout at men like Crenshaw, when I want to tell you I love you out loud instead of writing it, when I imagine having children someday and wonder how I'll communicate with them." He paused, then continued, "But mostly, no. This is who I am. My silence taught me to observe, to listen, really listen, to communicate in ways most people never learn. It made me patient and thoughtful. It made me see value in actions over words. Would I choose it if given a choice? Maybe not, but I can't regret something that made me who I am, the man you fell in love with." Clara's throat tightened. "You're remarkable, do you know that?" "I'm ordinary," Luke wrote. "Just a man who learned to work with what he has instead of mourning what he doesn't." "That's what makes you remarkable," Clara insisted. She took his scarred hand in hers, tracing the lines. "These hands speak volumes, Luke. Every callus, every scar tells a story of perseverance and hard work. You don't need words when your whole life is an eloquent testimony to your character." Luke pulled her close, and they sat like that as the summer night deepened around them. Two souls who'd found each other across silence and circumstance and had built something real from the ruins of their separate loneliness. In the distance, a coyote called, and another answered. Clara thought about voices and silence, about all the ways people communicated and all the ways love manifested. She'd once thought she needed words, declarations, poetry, but Luke had taught her that love could be quiet, could exist in steady presence and patient teaching, in defended reputations and gentle touches, in the way someone looked at you like you hung the stars. "I'm glad I got on that train," Clara whispered into the darkness. Luke's arm tightened around her, and even without words, Clara understood his response perfectly. "So am I. So am I. So am I." August arrived with scorching heat and the kind of dry wind that made farmers anxious. Clara watched the sky obsessively now, having learned from Luke to read the subtle signs of coming weather. The corn stood tall in the south field, the stalks a vibrant green that seemed almost defiant against the parched prairie. Luke checked the irrigation system twice daily, his movements precise and worried. "It's going to be all right," Clara told him one evening as they surveyed the fields together. "You've prepared for this." Luke's expression was tense. He wrote, "A week without rain and even the irrigation won't be enough. The well water is already running lower than usual." "Then we pray for rain," Clara said simply. "And we trust that all your hard work will see us through." But Luke's anxiety was contagious, and Clara found herself startling awake at night at the slightest sound, hoping for the patter of rain on the roof. Beside her, Luke slept fitfully when he slept at all, often rising before dawn to check the fields by lantern light. On the 5th day without rain, Clara found him standing in the cornfield at midday, despite the brutal heat. His hand rested on a stalk, and even from a distance, she could see the defeat in his posture. She brought him water and stood beside him silently. "Show me," she finally said. Luke reached up and pulled down an ear of corn, carefully peeling back the husk. The kernels were forming, but they looked small, stressed. He wrote with his free hand, "Without rain in the next few days, we'll lose at least half the crop. Maybe more." "What can we do?" "Nothing. Just wait and hope." His jaw was tight with frustration. Clara took his hand, squeezing firmly. "Then that's what we'll do. Together. And if we lose the crop, we'll figure out another way. We've survived worse than a bad harvest." Luke looked at her with such gratitude that her heart ached. He pulled her close, pressing his forehead to hers, and they stood like that in the middle of the struggling field, two people holding on to each other against an uncertain future. That night the wind shifted. Clara woke to Luke sitting bolt upright in bed, his hand on her shoulder. She could feel the tension in his grip. "What is it?" she whispered, then heard it, a distant rumble of thunder. Luke was already out of bed, moving to the window. Clara joined him, and together they watched clouds rolling in from the west, backlit by lightning that flickered like distant artillery fire. "Rain?" Clara breathed hopefully. Luke nodded, but his expression was complicated. He reached for his ever-present notebook. "Rain, yes, but maybe a storm too. Could save the crops or destroy them depending on how bad it gets." The storm hit an hour before dawn with a violence that made the little house shudder. Rain lashed the windows, and wind howled around the eaves like something alive and angry. Clara and Luke dressed quickly, both understanding without words that they needed to be ready for whatever damage the storm might bring. Lightning illuminated the world in stark flashes. The barn, the chicken coop, the fields bending under the wind's assault. Thunder cracked so loudly it felt physical, rattling Clara's bones. She moved close to Luke, and his arm came around her automatically, protective. "The animals," Clara said, raising her voice to be heard over the storm. Luke was already reaching for his coat. He wrote quickly, "I'll check the barn. You stay here where it's safe." "Absolutely not," Clara said firmly. "We go together or not at all." Luke's jaw set stubbornly, but Clara matched his expression. Finally, he nodded, and they ventured out into the maelstrom together. The world was chaos. Rain so thick Clara could barely see 3 feet ahead, wind that threatened to knock them both off their feet, mud that sucked at their boots with every step. They made it to the barn to find the horses wild-eyed with fear but unharmed. Luke checked the structure quickly while Clara soothed Dolly and Buck with touch and voice. "What about the chicken coop?" Clara shouted over the storm. Luke's face was grim. The coop was smaller, flimsier. He gestured for Clara to stay put, but she shook her head stubbornly. They fought their way across the yard together, and Clara's heart sank when she saw the coop's door hanging open, blown loose by the wind. "Henrietta!" Clara cried, thinking of her favorite hen and the eggs she'd been sitting on. She pushed past Luke into the coop, holding her lantern high. Several chickens huddled in the corners, terrified but present. But Henrietta's nest was empty. Clara's throat tightened with irrational grief. It was just a chicken, she told herself, but Henrietta had been the first animal she'd really bonded with on the farm, and the thought of her chicks never hatching made Clara's eyes sting. Luke touched her shoulder, understanding without explanation. He gestured, "Wait here," and disappeared back into the storm. Clara wanted to follow, but forced herself to stay, securing the remaining chickens and repairing the door as best she could with shaking hands. Minutes stretched into eternity. Clara's anxiety grew with each passing moment. What if Luke had been hurt? What if he'd fallen in the darkness, knocked unconscious by debris? She was just about to go searching for him when he reappeared, soaked through and covered in mud, cradling something against his chest. It was Henrietta, bedraggled and furious but alive. And tucked against her were 3 tiny peeping chicks, impossibly fragile and somehow still intact. "Oh, Luke," Clara breathed, taking the hen carefully. "You found them." Luke's smile was tired but genuine. He'd risked himself in a dangerous storm to rescue a chicken and her babies because he knew it would matter to Clara. Her heart swelled with love so intense it was almost painful. She settled Henrietta and the chicks in a protected corner of the coop, then turned to Luke and kissed him fiercely, tasting rain and mud and gratitude. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, she said, "Thank you for understanding, for caring about something that probably seemed silly to you." Luke shook his head and pulled out his soaked notebook. The pages were damp, but he managed to write, "Not silly. You love her. That makes her important." They made it back to the house as dawn began to gray the eastern sky. The storm was passing, the rain gentling to a steady drumming. Luke built up the fire while Clara made coffee, and they sat wrapped in blankets, watching the day break through windows streaked with rain. "Do you think the corn survived?" Clara asked quietly. Luke's expression was weary. "We'll know in a few hours. The rain will help if the wind didn't break too many stalks." They waited until full light, then ventured out to survey the damage. The yard was a mess of debris, branches, scattered tools, a section of fence that would need repairs. But when they reached the cornfield, Clara felt relief wash through her. The stalks were battered, leaning in places, but mostly intact, and the earth was soaked, properly soaked, for the first time in weeks. Luke walked through the rows slowly, checking plants with careful hands. When he returned to where Clara waited, his eyes were bright with cautious hope. Some damage, but the irrigation system held. Most of the crop should make it now. The rain came just in time. Clara threw her arms around him, laughing with relief. They stood in the muddy field, holding each other, and Clara thought about resilience, about how much could be endured and survived with the right partner beside you. The storm had one more gift to give. That afternoon, as they worked to clean up the debris, a wagon approached from town. Sarah Chen climbed down, followed by Emma Yates and 3 other women Clara recognized from church. "We heard the storm hit your place hard," Sarah said without preamble. "Came to help with cleanup and bring food. No one should face this alone." Clara was momentarily speechless. Luke beside her looked equally surprised. They'd been so isolated, so used to handling everything themselves, that the offer of community support felt almost foreign. That's incredibly kind," Clara managed. "Thank you." The women set to work with practiced efficiency, clearing debris, repairing the fence, checking buildings for damage. Someone had brought a basket of fresh bread and cold chicken, and they all ate together at midday, sitting on the porch in a companionable group. Emma approached Clara as they worked side by side, repairing the garden fence. "Mrs. Holbrook, Clara, I wanted to say what you did in town last month, standing up to Mr. Crenshaw. That was brave. He's bullied people for years and no one challenges him." "He was insulting my husband," Clara said simply. "I won't tolerate that." "I know, and it matters." Emma's voice dropped lower. "My brothers say Luke's the best farmer they've seen, that he innovates instead of just doing things the way they've always been done. They respect him, even if some folks in town don't." Clara felt warmth spread through her chest. "Thank you for telling me that." As the afternoon wore on and the cleanup progressed, Clara found herself watching Luke interact with the women who'd come to help. He couldn't engage in the usual banter and gossip that flowed naturally among them, but he communicated through nods and gestures, through showing rather than telling. And Clara noticed that the women didn't treat him with pity or awkwardness. They simply accepted his silence as part of who he was and worked around it naturally. When the group finally departed as evening approached, Sarah pulled Clara aside. "You're building a good life here. Don't let anyone make you doubt that." "Some days I don't doubt it at all," Clara admitted. Other days are hard," Sarah finished. "That's true for everyone. But you've got something real with Luke. I can see it. The way you work together, defend each other, understand each other without words. That's rarer than you might think." After they'd gone, Clara and Luke sat on their porch, exhausted but satisfied. The farm was battered but standing. The crops would survive. They had friends, actual friends. In this community they'd begun to build a life within. "Today was good," Clara said softly. "Frightening and exhausting, but good. We made it through." Luke's hand found hers, squeezing gently. He wrote with his free hand, "We make a good team, in storms and in sunshine." "We do," Clara agreed, then hesitated before voicing something that had been on her mind for weeks. "Luke, I've been thinking about the future, about children." Luke's hand stilled in hers. He turned to face her fully, his expression cautious and questioning. "I know we haven't discussed it," Clara continued, feeling her way through the conversation carefully. "And I know you worry about how you'd communicate with a child, but I think—" She took a breath. "I think you'd be a wonderful father. You're patient and gentle, and you know how to show love through actions. A child would be lucky to have you." Luke's eyes were very bright. He wrote slowly, "I want children, want to build a family with you, but I worry they'll be ashamed of having a father who can't speak, that other children will mock them." "Children might be cruel," Clara acknowledged, "but they'll have us to teach them that their father's silence doesn't define his worth. They'll grow up seeing how hard you work, how much you love them, how you communicate in ways that matter.
and they'll be strong because of it." "You really believe that?" "I do," Clara said firmly.
Look at what you've taught me in just a few months. Patience, observation, the importance of action over empty words. Imagine what you could teach a child who grows up knowing no different. They'd learn 2 languages, words from me and everything else from you. Luke pulled her close, and Clara felt his chest heave with emotion. When he finally pulled back to write again, his hand shook slightly. "I never thought anyone would want to have children with me, that I'd ever be given that chance. You keep giving me things I thought were impossible." "You give me things too," Clara said softly. "Safety, partnership, love that shows itself in actions every single day. We give each other a life worth living, Luke. That's no small thing." They kissed as the sun set, and Clara felt the rightness of their life together settle into her bones. The strange marriage that had started with deception and desperation had become something beautiful and real. The weeks following the storm brought harvest season closer, and with it, a frenetic pace of work. The corn had survived and was ripening well. The wheat in the east field was golden and ready, and the garden was producing more vegetables than Clara knew what to do with. She spent long hours preserving food for winter, pickling, canning, drying, while Luke worked the fields from first light until dark. They fell into bed exhausted each night, but there was satisfaction in the exhaustion. They were building something together, creating a life that would sustain them through the harsh Dakota winter. And gradually, Clara realized she'd stopped thinking of this as temporary or contingent. This was her home. Luke was her husband in every sense. This was simply her life now, and she was content with it. One evening in late August, as they sat shelling peas together on the porch, Luke suddenly went still. Clara looked up to see him staring at the horizon, his whole body tense. "What is it?" she asked, following his gaze. Then she saw it, a column of dark smoke rising in the distance. Luke was already moving, grabbing his hat and heading for the barn. Clara followed quickly. "Where's that coming from?" Luke pointed as he hitched up the wagon with frantic speed, then wrote hastily. "Southeast. Looks like Crenshaw's place. Big fire by the size of that smoke." "We're going to help?" Clara asked, surprised, given Crenshaw's treatment of them. Luke's expression was grim but determined. "Fire doesn't care about grudges. Everyone helps with fires, or we all burn eventually." They drove fast, arriving to find Crenshaw's barn engulfed in flames and a crowd of neighbors already working to contain it. The heat was intense even from a distance, and Clara could hear the terrified screaming of trapped animals. Luke leaped down from the wagon and ran toward the barn without hesitation. Clara's heart seized with fear as she watched him disappear into the smoke billowing from the open doors. "He'll get himself killed," someone shouted, one of Crenshaw's farmhands. Clara stood frozen, every instinct screaming at her to run after Luke, to pull him back, to keep him safe. But she forced herself to stay put, to trust in his knowledge and capability. Luke knew what he was doing. He had to. Seconds felt like hours. Other men were fighting the fire with bucket chains from the well, but the barn was already lost. The goal now was just to keep it from spreading to the house and other structures. Then Luke emerged from the smoke, leading a panicked horse by its halter. Behind him, another man appeared with a second horse. They'd gotten the animals out. Clara's knees went weak with relief. But Luke wasn't done. He handed off the horse and turned back toward the barn. Clara saw his intention, and her heart stopped. "No!" she screamed, running toward him. "Luke, no!" "It's not safe!" He turned, and their eyes met across the chaos. Clara saw the determination in his face. There were more animals inside, and he couldn't leave them to burn. He held up one hand. "Wait, trust me." Then disappeared back into the inferno. Clara stood at the edge of the safe zone, her hands clenched so tight her nails drew blood. Around her, people shouted instructions, hauled water, worked to save what could be saved. But all Clara could see was the barn entrance, willing Luke to reappear. The roof was starting to collapse, timber groaning under the heat. Someone grabbed Clara's arm as she started forward. "You can't go in there, Mrs. Holbrook. It's too dangerous." "My husband is in there." Clara's voice broke on the words. "He knew the risk. If he's not out by now." But then Luke emerged again, this time carrying something small against his chest, his other hand gripping the collar of a limping dog. His shirt was singed, his face black with soot, and he was coughing violently. But he was alive. Clara ran to him, tears streaming down her face. "You absolute fool! You could have died!" Luke set down what he'd been carrying, a box of squirming barn kittens, and let someone else take the injured dog. Then he pulled Clara close, his body shaking with exertion and coughing. "Don't ever do that again," Clara sobbed into his chest. "Don't you dare risk yourself like that. I can't lose you, Luke. I can't." Luke's arms tightened around her, and Clara felt him nod against her hair. But even as she held him, she knew he'd do it again if needed. It was who he was, the man who'd rescue chickens in a storm and kittens from a fire, because vulnerable creatures deserved protection and all life had value. When Luke finally stopped coughing enough to write, his hand was shaky. "I'm all right. Just smoke. I'm sorry I scared you." "You terrified me," Clara said, but her anger was fading into overwhelming relief and love. "But I understand why you did it." They stayed for hours, helping to contain the fire and salvage what they could. By the time the flames were finally out, the barn was a smoking ruin, but the house and other buildings had been saved. Crenshaw's horses and other livestock were safe, largely thanks to Luke's quick action. As people began to disperse, Crenshaw approached them. His face was drawn, aged by the night's trauma. He looked at Luke for a long moment, something complicated working in his expression. "Holbrook," he finally said, his voice rough with smoke and emotion. "You saved my horses, saved my dog and those damn barn cats my wife loves. You risked your neck for my property after I've been nothing but hostile to you." Luke nodded slightly, acknowledging the truth of it. "Why?" Crenshaw asked bluntly. Luke pulled out his notebook, the pages now smudged with soot. He wrote carefully and turned it so Crenshaw could read. Because it was the right thing to do. Because animals don't deserve to suffer for human grudges. Because neighbors help neighbors, even when those neighbors have been unkind. Crenshaw read it twice, his jaw working. "I owe you an apology," he finally said, the words clearly difficult. "I've treated you poorly since you came to Redemption, made assumptions about your abilities based on your condition. I was wrong. You're twice the man I gave you credit for." Luke's eyebrows rose slightly. This was clearly unexpected. "And you, Mrs. Holbrook," Crenshaw continued, turning to Clara. "You were right when you defended him in town. Your husband is an excellent farmer and a good man. Better than me in most ways that matter." He extended his hand to Luke. "If you'll accept it, I'd like to start over. Be the neighbor I should have been from the start." Luke looked at the offered hand for a moment, then grasped it firmly. Clara saw understanding pass between the two men. Not quite friendship yet, but the beginning of mutual respect. As they drove home in the pre-dawn darkness, exhausted and reeking of smoke, Clara kept one hand on Luke's knee, needing the physical reassurance that he was real and whole beside her. "You scared me tonight," she said quietly. "Worse than I've ever been scared. When you went back into that barn, I thought I might lose you." Luke's hand covered hers. He couldn't write while driving, but the pressure of his fingers communicated everything: apology, love, understanding. "I know you had to do it," Clara continued. "I know it's who you are. But Luke, I need you to understand something. You're not alone anymore. You don't have to be the only one who takes risks or makes sacrifices. We're partners. That means we face dangers together or we avoid them together. Your life matters to me. It matters so much that the thought of losing it makes me feel like I can't breathe." Luke pulled the wagon to a stop right there in the middle of the road. He turned to face Clara fully, his expression intense in the fading starlight. He pulled out his notebook, and by the light of the lantern hanging from the wagon, he wrote, "I've spent my whole life being expendable. The mute man no one would miss. Tonight, when I went into that barn, part of me still thought that way, that my life mattered less than others. But you're right. I'm not alone anymore. I have you. And you deserve a husband who values his own life because you value it. I'm sorry. I'll try to be more careful." Clara's throat was too tight for words. She just pulled him close, kissing him with desperate relief and love. They held each other in the middle of that empty road as the sun began to rise,
Two people who'd found each other against all odds and were learning, slowly, to navigate life as a team.
When they finally made it home, they collapsed into bed without even washing off the soot. Clara curled into Luke's side, her hand over his steadily beating heart, and fell asleep to the rhythm of his breathing, alive, present, hers. The next few days brought unexpected changes. Word of Luke's heroism spread through redemption faster than the fire itself. Suddenly, people who'd ignored or dismissed him for years were stopping by the farm to express gratitude or admiration. Women brought food, men offered to help with harvest, and even Pastor Williams paid a visit to thank Luke personally for his bravery and selflessness. "You've become quite the local hero," Clara teased one evening as they reviewed yet another basket of baked goods from a grateful neighbor. Luke looked uncomfortable with the attention. He wrote, "I just did what anyone would do." "No," Clara said firmly. "You did what you would do. Not everyone would risk their life for someone else's animals, especially not for someone who treated them poorly. That's what makes it remarkable." "I don't want to be remarkable. I just want to be a good farmer and a good husband." "Well, you're both," Clara said, kissing his cheek, "whether you want to be or not." The attention gradually died down as harvest season demanded everyone's focus. Luke and Clara worked side by side cutting wheat, shocking corn, gathering the last of the garden vegetables. It was brutal work, but there was something deeply satisfying about it. The tangible proof of their labor, the security of full storage for winter, the knowledge that they'd built this together. On the last day of harvest, as the sun set over fields stripped clean and productive, Luke and Clara stood together surveying their work. They were exhausted, dirty, and achingly proud. "We did it," Clara said softly. "Our first full harvest together. And it's good, Luke. Really good." Luke pulled her close, and they stood like that as twilight deepened around them. No words needed, no grand declarations. Just two people who'd learned to communicate across silence, who'd built a life from nothing, who'd chosen each other every day, even when it was hard. Clara thought about the woman who'd stepped off that train months ago, scared, desperate, uncertain. She barely recognized that person now. This Clara was strong, capable, loved, home. "Thank you," she whispered into Luke's chest. He pulled back slightly, questioning with his expression. "For choosing me," Clara clarified, "for placing that advertisement, for giving me a chance at this life. I know it wasn't what either of us expected, but I wouldn't trade it for anything." Luke's smile was gentle and knowing. He didn't need to write his response. Clara could read it in his eyes, in the way he held her, in every action he'd taken since she'd arrived. He was grateful, too, for her, for them, for this strange and beautiful life they'd built together. As they walked back to the house hand in hand, Clara realized something profound. She'd come to Dakota Territory looking for security and found so much more. She'd found partnership and purpose. She'd found a man who spoke to her heart even without words. She'd found home. And she'd learned that sometimes the most eloquent conversations happened in complete silence. The first snow came in late October, earlier than expected, dusting the prairie in white and turning their world quiet in a different way. Clara stood at the kitchen window watching the flakes fall, her hand resting unconsciously on her still flat stomach. She hadn't told Luke yet, wasn't entirely certain herself, though her body was giving her signs she couldn't ignore. The tenderness, the exhaustion, the way certain smells made her queasy. She'd missed her monthly courses twice now, and this morning she'd been sick before breakfast. A baby. The thought filled her with equal parts joy and terror. They'd talked about children, yes, but talking and facing the reality were entirely different things. How would Luke react? Would he be happy or frightened? And how would they manage with an infant when communication was already complicated? Luke came in from checking the animals, stamping snow from his boots and bringing cold air with him. His eyes found Clara immediately, and his expression shifted to concern. He crossed to her quickly, touching her forehead as if checking for fever. "I'm fine," Clara said, but her voice came out shaky. "Just thinking." Luke's eyebrows drew together, questioning. He pulled out his notebook, but Clara stopped him with a hand on his arm. "Wait. There's something I need to tell you, and I'm not sure how." She took a breath, gathering courage. "Luke, I think I'm fairly certain that I'm pregnant. Luke went absolutely still. His eyes widened, dropping to her stomach and then back to her face. The notebook fell from his hand, forgotten. For a long moment he just stared at her, and Clara couldn't read his expression. Shock, certainly, but beyond that? Say something, she pleaded, then caught herself with a broken laugh. Write something, please. I need to know what you're thinking. Luke bent to retrieve his notebook with trembling hands. He wrote, crossed out, wrote again. Are you sure? Not completely, but I'm 2 months late. I've been sick in the mornings, and I'm so tired all the time. I think I need to see a doctor to be certain, but yes, I'm fairly sure. Luke sank into a chair as if his legs wouldn't hold him anymore. He wrote, a baby. Our baby. How do you feel about that? Clara asked anxiously. Luke looked up at her, and Clara saw his eyes were wet with tears. He wrote quickly, his hand shaking, terrified, amazed, grateful, unworthy, everything at once. Clara, I never let myself imagine that you'd have a family, Clara finished softly, moving to kneel beside his chair. Luke, you're going to be an incredible father. I know you're worried about the silence, but our child is going to be so loved. They'll have you teaching them patience and observation and the value of actions over empty words. They'll have me to give them language. They'll be fine, better than fine. Luke pulled her into his lap, burying his face in her hair. Clara felt his chest heave with silent sobs, overwhelming emotion that he couldn't vocalize, finding release in shaking shoulders and tears that dampened her collar. She held him tightly, her own tears falling freely. We're going to be parents, she whispered. We're going to have a baby, Luke. When he could finally write again, his message was simple but profound. Thank you for choosing me, for giving me this, for making me believe I could have something this precious. You deserve this, Clara said fiercely. You deserve a family and love and every good thing. Don't you ever doubt that. They sat together in the kitchen as snow continued to fall outside. Two people who'd been alone for so long now facing the reality that they'd created a new life together. It was overwhelming and beautiful and frightening, but they had each other. That was what mattered. The next day, they made the trip into town to see Dr. Morrison, an older man with kind eyes and steady hands. He confirmed what Clara already knew. She was approximately 10 weeks pregnant, healthy, and the baby should arrive sometime in May. First child? Dr. Morrison asked as he helped Clara sit up from the examination. Yes, Clara said, reaching for Luke's hand. For both of us. The doctor nodded, glancing at Luke. Mr. Holbrook, I'm going to give your wife some instructions for her care during the pregnancy. You'll need to make sure she follows them. He spoke slowly and clearly, the way people often did with Luke, and Clara felt irritation flash through her. Doctor, she said firmly, my husband can hear perfectly well. He simply can't respond verbally. If you have instructions, please give them to both of us, and he can write down any questions he has. Dr. Morrison had the grace to look embarrassed. Of course. My apologies, Mr. Holbrook. Luke nodded, his expression neutral, but Clara could feel tension in his grip. They'd faced this countless times, people making assumptions, speaking over Luke or around him as if he wasn't present. It never stopped being frustrating. As they left the doctor's office, Luke wrote, Thank you for defending me. Again. Though you don't always have to. Yes, I do, Clara said. Until people learn to see you properly, I absolutely do. Besides, I'm carrying your child. If I don't stand up for their father, what kind of example am I setting? Luke's expression softened. He cupped her face gently, kissing her with such tenderness that Clara felt tears prick her eyes again. Pregnancy was making her emotional, but this love between them was real and strong enough to weather anything. News of Clara's pregnancy spread through Redemption with predictable speed. Women who'd been friendly became even more so, offering advice and hand-me-down baby clothes. Even Mrs. Henderson managed to be almost warm when she congratulated Clara at the general store. You're first, Mrs. Henderson said, her expression nostalgic. It's a special thing, bringing a new life into the world. Though I do wonder, she paused delicately. Wonder what? Clara asked, though she could guess. Well, how will Mr. Holbrook manage with an infant? Babies need so much attention, and communication is so important in those early years. Clara felt her patience snap. My husband will manage beautifully, Mrs. Henderson. He's patient, observant, and gentle. He notices things most people miss. A baby won't need words, they'll need presence and care and love, all of which Luke has in abundance. I pity children whose fathers talk constantly but never truly listen. Mrs. Henderson's face flushed. Well, I meant no offense. Then please stop offering it, Clara said coolly, gathering her purchases. Good day. Outside, Luke was waiting by the wagon. He took one look at Clara's face and his eyebrows rose questioningly. Mrs. Henderson expressing concern about your ability to parent, Clara said shortly. I may have been less than gracious in my response. Luke's mouth twitched. He wrote, I heard through the window. You weren't ungracious. You were magnificent. Despite her irritation, Clara laughed. I'm getting quite good at defending you, aren't I? You are. Though I hope our child inherits your ability to speak truth to power, and maybe a bit of your temper, too. It serves you well. And what do you hope they inherit from you? Clara asked softly. Luke thought for a long moment before writing, resilience, the ability to find other ways when the obvious path is blocked. Patience, the knowledge that silence isn't emptiness, it's space for observation and understanding. And maybe, if I'm lucky, my eyes. I've always liked my eyes. Clara laughed through sudden tears. I love your eyes. They're the first thing I really noticed about you, how much they revealed when you couldn't speak. They drove home through snow that was falling more heavily now, and Clara felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. They would face whatever challenges came. Together, they always did. Winter deepened, and with it came a different kind of isolation. The snow piled high, making trips to town difficult and dangerous. Luke worked close to home now, tending animals and doing indoor repairs while Clara managed the house and dealt with the exhausting early months of pregnancy. Some days she felt fine. Others, she could barely get out of bed. Luke was endlessly patient, bringing her ginger tea for the nausea, taking over her chores without complaint, sitting with her during the bad days and reading aloud from her favorite books to distract her. You're too good to me, Clara murmured one evening as Luke brought her soup he'd carefully prepared. He wrote, Impossible. You're carrying our child. I can never be good enough to deserve that gift. Luke Holbrook, you stop that right now, Clara said, summoning energy to be firm. You deserve this baby every bit as much as I do. You deserve happiness and family and love. I won't hear you say otherwise. Luke smiled and kissed her forehead, but Clara saw the doubt lingering in his eyes. For all his strength and capability, there was still a part of Luke that couldn't quite believe he was worthy of good things. A lifetime of rejection had left scars deeper than any on his hands. Christmas came quietly. They attended church on Christmas Eve, and Clara noticed how the community had changed toward them. People who'd once whispered now smiled genuine greetings. Children stared at Luke with curiosity rather than fear. Robert Crenshaw even clapped Luke on the shoulder and wished them well with the coming baby. You've become respectable, Clara teased as they drove home through crystalline snow under a sky full of stars. Luke's expression was wry. He wrote, Only because I nearly died saving Crenshaw's property. Apparently heroism makes up for not being able to speak. That's not fair, but probably true, Clara admitted. People are foolish about what they value, but I'm glad they're treating you better, even if their reasons are stupid. Me too. For your sake and the baby's. I want our child to grow up in a place where their father is respected, not pitied. They will, Clara said firmly. I'll make sure of it. On Christmas morning, Luke gave Clara a carved cradle he'd been working on in secret for weeks. It was beautiful, smooth pine with delicate rose patterns carved into the headboard, sturdy enough to last for multiple children. Clara ran her fingers over the careful workmanship and wept. It's perfect, she managed through tears. Luke, it's absolutely perfect. He wrote, I wanted our baby's first bed to be made with my hands, so they'd know from the beginning that I love them, even if I can't tell them so out loud. Clara's gift to Luke was simpler, but no less meaningful. a leather-bound journal with his name embossed on the cover. "For your thoughts," she explained, "for everything you want to say to our child as they grow. You can write them letters they'll read someday, your wisdom, your experiences, your love. Just because you can't speak doesn't mean your voice shouldn't be heard." Luke held the journal like it was made of glass, his eyes bright with emotion. He opened to the first page and wrote carefully, "To our child, you were wanted before you were conceived, loved before you were born, and treasured beyond measure before we ever saw your face. May these pages teach you that words written with care and love speak just as loudly as words spoken. Your father." Clara read it and couldn't stop crying. "That's beautiful. That's so beautiful, Luke." They spent Christmas Day together in their snug little house, snow falling outside while they sat by the fire. Luke's hand rested on Clara's growing belly, and they talked about names and dreams and the future. It was the happiest Christmas Clara had ever known. January and February passed in a blur of cold and preparation. Luke built shelves in the bedroom for the baby's things. Clara sewed tiny clothes from fabric Sarah Chen had given her heart full of wonder at how impossibly small they were. They read books about childcare and argued good-naturedly about parenting approaches, Luke writing long, detailed opinions that made Clara laugh and love him even more. In early March, disaster struck in the form of influenza. It swept through Redemption like wildfire, and within days, half the town was sick. Clara felt the first symptoms on a Tuesday: fever, chills, body aches that made her bones feel like they were breaking. Luke put her to bed immediately, his face tight with worry. "It's just flu," Clara tried to reassure him through chattering teeth. "I'll be fine in a few days." But Luke's expression was grim. He'd seen what influenza could do, especially to pregnant women. He wrote, "I'm getting Dr. Morrison. The snow's too deep. You'll never make it to town and back before dark." "I'll make it. You and the baby need proper care." "Luke, no!" But he was already bundling up, his face set in that stubborn expression Clara had come to know well. "Please, don't risk yourself. I'll be all right." Luke knelt beside the bed and wrote quickly, "You told me after the fire that my life matters because it matters to you. Well, your life matters to me more than my own. You're carrying our child. I will do whatever it takes to keep you both safe. That includes riding through a snowstorm if necessary." Before Clara could argue further, he kissed her burning forehead and was gone. Clara lay in the too-quiet house, fever making the shadows dance, and prayed desperately for his safe return. Hours passed. Clara drifted in and out of feverish dreams, sometimes thinking she heard the wind howling, sometimes certain it was wolves or worse. When she woke fully, it was dark and Luke still wasn't back. Panic clawed at her throat. What if he'd gotten lost? What if he'd frozen? What if she'd sent him to his death by being sick? Then she heard it, the sound of horses, voices, the door opening. Luke appeared at the bedroom door with Dr. Morrison behind him, both men covered in snow and ice. "Foolish time to drag an old man out in a blizzard," Dr. Morrison grumbled, but his eyes were kind as he examined Clara. "Though I suppose I can't fault a man for wanting to protect his wife and child." The doctor confirmed it was influenza and gave instructions for care, fever management, fluids, rest. "The danger is if it settles in her lungs or if the fever spikes too high. Could affect the baby. You'll need to watch her closely, Mr. Holbrook. Can you do that?" Luke nodded emphatically and wrote, "I won't leave her side." "Good man." Dr. Morrison prepared to leave, but the storm had worsened. Luke insisted he stay until morning rather than risk the return journey in darkness, and the doctor accepted gratefully. For the next 3 days, Luke barely slept. He kept cool cloths on Clara's forehead, made her drink water and broth even when she protested, changed her sweat-soaked nightgown, and held her when she shook with chills. He tracked her fever obsessively, writing down each reading, comparing them to the doctor's instructions. In her more lucid moments, Clara watched him move around the room with quiet efficiency and felt her love for him expand beyond what she'd thought possible. He'd risked his life to get her help, and now he was sacrificing sleep and his own health to care for her. This was love, not grand gestures or flowery words, but steady presence in the face of fear. On the 4th day, Clara's fever finally broke. She woke to find Luke asleep in the chair beside the bed, his head pillowed on his arms on the mattress near her hand. He looked exhausted, his face gaunt with worry and lack of sleep. Clara ran her fingers through his hair gently, and his eyes opened immediately. "I'm better," she whispered. "The fever's gone." Luke sat up quickly, touching her forehead to confirm it himself. Then his shoulders sagged with relief so profound he nearly collapsed. He grabbed his notebook with shaking hands. "Thank God. I was so scared. The fever was so high yesterday. I couldn't bear to think what I thought." "I'm all right," Clara soothed. "We're all right. The baby's still moving. I can feel little flutters. You saved us, Luke, you and your stubborn determination to ride through a blizzard." "I'd ride through hell itself for you," he wrote simply. "I know," Clara said, tears streaming down her face. "I know you would. I love you so much, Luke. So very much." Luke climbed carefully onto the bed beside her, holding her with infinite gentleness as if she might break. They lay like that for a long time, grateful for life and health and each other. Clara recovered slowly over the following weeks. Luke insisted she rest more than she wanted, bringing her meals in bed and taking over all the household duties without complaint. The baby, miraculously, seemed unaffected by Clara's illness. She could feel strong kicks now, and Luke would spend hours with his hand on her belly, marveling at each movement. "Active one," Clara commented one evening as a particularly strong kick made her wince. "Takes after you, I think, stubborn and determined." Luke's eyes crinkled with silent laughter. He wrote, "Poor child, inheriting my stubbornness and your temper. They'll be a force of nature." "They'll be perfect," Clara said firmly, "no matter what they inherit from us." April arrived with muddy roads and the first brave flowers pushing through the last snow. Clara was enormous now, uncomfortable and eager to meet this child who'd become so real to them. Luke finished the last preparations, the cradle stationed beside their bed, tiny clothes washed and folded, supplies gathered for the birth. Dr. Morrison had given them clear instructions, and Sarah Chen had promised to assist when the time came. Clara tried not to be frightened, but she'd heard too many stories of women who didn't survive childbirth, babies who didn't take their first breath. The stakes felt impossibly high. "What if something goes wrong?" she asked Luke one night, voicing her deepest fear. "What if I die? Or the baby does, or both of us?" Luke's face went pale. He wrote with visible distress, "Don't say that. Don't even think it. You're strong and healthy. Dr. Morrison says everything looks good. You'll be fine. You have to be fine." "But if I'm not—" "Clara, please." His hand shook as he wrote, "I can't lose you. I can't face that possibility. You and this baby are everything to me. Everything." Clara took his trembling hands in hers. "Then promise me something. If it comes to a choice, if Dr. Morrison has to choose between me and the baby, you choose me. Do you understand? You save me." Luke's expression was agonized. He shook his head violently and wrote, "I can't make that choice. Don't ask me to." "I'm not asking," Clara said gently but firmly. "I'm telling you, our baby deserves to have a mother. More than that, you deserve to have a wife. Promise me, Luke, please." After a long, painful moment, Luke nodded and wrote, "I promise, but it won't come to that. It won't." Clara prayed he was right. The labor started on a warm evening in mid-May, 3 years to the day after Clara had first stepped off that train. She was weeding the garden when she felt the first real contraction, different from the practice pains she'd been having for weeks. She straightened slowly, one hand on her back, and caught Luke's eye where he was working on the fence. He knew immediately. He dropped his tools and came to her quickly, his expression both excited and terrified. Clara smiled despite the tightening in her belly. "It's time," she said simply. Luke's eyes went wide. He wrote, "Are you sure? Should I get Dr. Morrison? Sarah? Both?" "Not yet. First babies take a long time. We have hours yet." But Luke was already moving, hitching up the wagon with frantic speed. Clara laughed, then stopped as another contraction hit. Maybe this wouldn't take quite as long as she'd thought. Luke drove to town faster than was probably safe, helped Clara into Dr. Morrison's office, then went to fetch Sarah Chen as promised. By the time they all returned to the farm, Clara's contractions were coming regularly and with increasing intensity. "You're doing well," Dr. Morrison said after examining her. "Everything looks normal. Now comes the hard part, the waiting." The waiting was indeed hard. Hours passed with contractions that came closer and closer together, each one stealing Clara's breath and making her wonder how women had been doing this since the beginning of time. Luke stayed beside her the entire time, holding her hand, wiping her face with cool cloths, his eyes never leaving hers. He couldn't speak words of encouragement, but his presence alone gave Clara strength. "You're doing beautifully," Sarah murmured during a brief respite. "Not much longer now." When the final stage of labor came, it was harder than anything Clara had ever experienced. Pain that made her scream, effort that left her shaking and exhausted, fear that this would never end. Through it all, Luke held her hand so tightly she thought bones might break, his face white with vicarious agony. His eyes pleaded with her, "Keep going, stay with me, you can do this." And finally, mercifully, a baby's cry split the air. "It's a girl," Dr. Morrison announced, his voice warm with satisfaction. "A healthy baby girl." Luke's face transformed, from fear to joy, to wonder so profound he looked like a different person entirely. Tears streamed down his face as Dr. Morrison placed the baby, cleaned and swaddled, into Clara's arms. She was perfect. Impossibly tiny, red-faced and crying lustily, but perfect. She had Luke's dark hair already, and what looked like Clara's nose. Clara stared at her daughter in absolute awe, unable to believe this miracle existed. "We have a daughter," she whispered, looking up at Luke through her own tears. "Luke, we have a daughter." Luke nodded, unable to even write, just staring at this tiny person they'd created. When Sarah gently suggested he might want to hold the baby, he looked terrified but held out his arms. Sarah placed the infant carefully in his large, scarred hands, and Luke cradled her like she was made of spun glass. The baby stopped crying almost immediately, her eyes, storm cloud blue like her father's, trying to focus on his face. Luke's expression was beyond description, love and wonder and fierce protectiveness all mingled together. He looked at Clara with such gratitude and joy that her heart felt too full for her chest. "What will you name her?" Dr. Morrison asked after he'd finished attending to Clara. Clara looked at Luke questioningly. They'd discussed names but never quite decided. Luke carefully handed the baby back to Clara and picked up his notebook with trembling hands. "Rose," he wrote, "for the wildflowers that grow on the prairie, for beauty in harsh places, for resilience and hope. Rose Holbrook." "Rose?" Clara repeated softly, looking down at her daughter. "That's perfect. Hello, Rose. We've been waiting for you." After Dr. Morrison and Sarah left, extracting promises from Luke that he'd fetch them if anything seemed wrong, the new family was alone together. Luke sat on the edge of the bed, one finger held in Rose's tiny fist, looking at his daughter with such intense love that Clara felt tears well up again. "You're going to be an amazing father," she said softly. "Look at how she's already comfortable with you. She knows you're hers." Luke looked up and Clara saw uncertainty flicker across his face. He wrote one-handed, "What if I can't communicate with her as she grows? What if my silence confuses or frustrates her?" "Then we'll figure it out together," Clara said firmly. "Luke, you communicate better than most people who can speak. You'll teach her to observe, to notice details, to understand that words are just one way to express love. She'll be bilingual. She'll speak with voice like me and speak with presence like you, and she'll be stronger for it." Luke bent and pressed a kiss to Rose's tiny forehead, then to Clara's lips. When he pulled back, his eyes were still wet, but his expression was determined. He wrote, "I promise to be the father she deserves, to love her with everything I am, to teach her that different doesn't mean less, to show her every day that she's valued and cherished." "I know you will," Clara said. "We both will." As evening turned to night, Clara dozed with Rose sleeping against her chest while Luke sat watch, unable to look away from his wife and daughter. He'd spent his whole life being told he was incomplete, broken, less than. But looking at Clara and Rose, he felt complete for the first time. These two people needed him, not despite his silence, but just as he was. The weeks following Rose's birth were a blur of exhaustion and joy. The baby cried frequently, needed constant care, turned their quiet house into something much louder. But watching Luke with their daughter made every difficult moment worthwhile. He was a natural, patient and gentle, seeming to understand what Rose needed even before Clara did. He'd wake for feedings, change diapers without complaint, walk the floors with her when she was fussy, his lips moving in soundless songs Clara couldn't hear, but Rose seemed to understand perfectly. "You're humming to her, aren't you?" Clara asked one night, watching them together. "I can't hear it, but I can see it in your face." Luke nodded, looking almost embarrassed. He wrote, "My mother used to hum lullabies to me. I can feel the vibration even if I can't hear the sound. I thought Rose might like it." "She loves it," Clara said, watching their daughter's peaceful expression. "Look at how calm she is with you." As Rose grew from newborn to infant, it became clear she was a perfect blend of both parents. She had Luke's eyes and hair, Clara's nose and chin. She was observant like her father, watching everything with intense focus. But she was also vocal like her mother, babbling constantly and seeming frustrated when her sounds didn't yet form words. The town embraced the new family warmly. Women brought meals and advice. Men congratulated Luke with genuine warmth. Even Mrs. Henderson softened completely when she held baby Rose, cooing over her in a way Clara never would have expected. "She's beautiful," Mrs. Henderson said, and for once there was no edge to her words. "You two have made a lovely family." One afternoon in late summer, when Rose was about 3 months old, Robert Crenshaw stopped by the farm. Luke was in the yard with Rose strapped to his chest in a sling Clara had made, working one-handed while the baby dozed against him. Clara watched from the porch as Crenshaw approached. "Holbrook," Crenshaw said, his tone respectful now. "I wanted to bring this by." He held out a small wooden box. "My wife made it. For your daughter." Luke opened the box carefully to reveal a beautiful silver rattle, clearly an heirloom. He looked at Crenshaw with surprise. "It was my grandmother's," Crenshaw explained. "Been in my family for generations. My wife and I, we never had children. She wants Rose to have it." He paused, looking uncomfortable. "I also wanted to say watching you with your daughter, the way you care for her. I was wrong about you, Holbrook, wrong about a lot of things. You're a good man and a good father. Your child is lucky to have you." Luke's eyes filled with tears. He shifted Rose carefully and extended his hand to Crenshaw. The two men shook, and Clara saw understanding and respect pass between them. True reconciliation earned through time and demonstrated character. After Crenshaw left, Clara joined Luke in the yard. He handed her the rattle, still looking stunned. "Things change," Clara said softly. "People change. You change this whole community just by being yourself. Steady, capable, kind. You showed them that silence doesn't mean weakness or inability. You showed them what real strength looks like." Luke pulled her close, careful not to squish Rose between them, and they stood like that in the late afternoon sun, a family, complete and content. That evening, as they sat on their porch bench with Rose nursing sleepily, Clara reflected on the journey that had brought them here. She'd stepped off that train expecting nothing more than survival, a practical arrangement with a stranger. Instead, she'd found partnership, purpose, and love deeper than she'd imagined possible. "Do you ever think about that first day?" she asked Luke. "When I almost got back on the train." Luke nodded, his hand resting protectively on Rose's back. He couldn't write with both hands full, but his expression said everything. Gratitude that she'd stayed, wonder at what they'd built together. "I'm glad I didn't leave," Clara continued. "I'm glad I gave us a chance. You've given me everything, Luke. A home, a family, a love I didn't know existed. You speak to me in ways words never could, through your actions, your presence, the way you love us so completely." Rose finished nursing and Clara shifted her to her shoulder, patting her back gently. Luke reached over and took Clara's free hand, lacing their fingers together. In the distance, the prairie grass rippled in the evening breeze, and somewhere a meadowlark sang its liquid song. Clara thought about voices and silence, about all the ways people spoke, and all the ways love manifested. She'd learned that the loudest declarations weren't always the most meaningful. That presence spoke louder than promises. That actions revealed character more than any words could. Luke had taught her to listen with more than her ears, to observe the small gestures, the consistent care,
the quiet devotion that showed itself in 1,000 tiny ways. He'd taught her that love didn't need a voice to be heard, that it could exist in the space between words, in the language of touch and presence and unwavering commitment. "I love you," Clara said softly, the words almost ritual now. She said them every day, multiple times, because she could and because she knew they mattered to Luke. Luke smiled and squeezed her hand, and Clara understood his response perfectly. She always did now. After more than a year together, they developed a language all their own, part written words, part gesture, part that inexplicable understanding that came from truly knowing another person. Rose stirred against Clara's shoulder, making the small sounds that meant she'd need changing soon. Luke stood and carefully took his daughter, cradling her with practiced ease as he headed inside. Clara followed, watching her silent husband coo soundlessly to their baby, and felt her heart swell with contentment. This was her life now, not the one she'd planned or expected, but the one she'd built alongside a man who'd taught her that words were overrated. They had a home filled with love, if not sound. They had a daughter who would grow up understanding that there were many ways to communicate, many ways to be heard. They had each other, and they had learned something profound, that the deepest conversations often happened in complete silence, that the truest declarations were written in actions rather than spoken aloud, and that love, real, lasting, transformative love, didn't need a voice to be eloquent. Luke returned with a changed and content Rose, settling back onto the bench beside Clara. The baby gazed up at both her parents with those storm cloud eyes she'd inherited from her father, and Clara could have sworn she saw understanding there, the beginning of recognition that she was loved, safe, and cherished. "Our daughter is going to be extraordinary," Clara said, stroking Rose's soft cheek. "She's going to grow up knowing 2 languages, mine and yours. She'll speak with her voice and listen with her whole being. She'll understand that different doesn't mean broken, and that the quietest people sometimes have the most to say." Luke's hand came up to cup Clara's face, his thumb brushing her cheekbone in that gesture she'd come to know so well. His eyes held hers, and in them Clara saw everything he couldn't say aloud: devotion, gratitude, wonder, and a love so profound it needed no words to be understood. She leaned in and kissed him softly, Rose held safe between them, and thought about how far they'd come from that first awkward day on the train platform. They'd built something beautiful from uncertainty and fear. They'd created a family from loneliness and necessity. They'd found love in the space between words, and as the sun set over the Dakota Prairie, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Clara Holbrook, formerly Whitmore, knew with absolute certainty that she was home. Not just in this place, but with these people. Her silent husband and their beautiful daughter, her family. The man without a voice had spoken to her in ways words never could, and she had learned to hear him perfectly. That was more than enough. That was everything. In the gathering twilight, with Rose dozing peacefully and Luke's arm warm around her shoulders, Clara smiled and whispered one last thought into the quiet evening. "Thank you for teaching me to listen." And though Luke made no sound, Clara felt his response in the way he held her tighter, in the kiss he pressed to her temple, in the steady beat of his heart beneath her hand. Sometimes, she'd learned, the most eloquent answers came wrapped in silence, and those were the ones worth listening for most of all.